The bottle was small enough to hide in a gentleman's coat pocket, slim enough to rest in a lady's gloved palm. Its label glowed softly beneath gaslight. Bayer's heroin for coughs, for nerves, for children. In parlors thick with cigar smoke and the warm hiss of radiators, it passed from hand to hand like a fashionable secret. 1 drop soothed the lungs, 2 drops softened the world, 3 drops erased it entirely. Chicago's elite called it a blessing. Its chemists called it a wonder. Only a few physicians, watching pupils pinprick under chandelier light, wondered what price the city would ultimately pay for something that felt this gentle. Outside, streetcars clattered along icy rails, carrying clerks, factory girls, and restless young men who clutched at small envelopes of the same shimmering cure. Pharmacies offered it freely, with the same polite confidence they used to sell tooth powders and glycerin soaps. The drug promised sleep without dreams, calm without consequence, strength without strain. And in an age obsessed with refinement, efficiency, and controlled emotion, who would resist a tonic that whispered it could make life easier? But heroin had a quieter voice too, one only heard in back rooms, in late-night surgeries, and in the trembling hands of patients who returned again and again, begging for just another bottle. Beneath Chicago's proud skyline, built on ambition and polished brass, the city began to collect shadows. Pale children who no longer played, mothers who drifted through rooms like ghosts, businessmen who collapsed in their offices, their miracle cure still uncorked beside them. Heroin had arrived as a gift. It would linger as a ruin. Stay with me, there are more shadows to follow. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. It began, as so many quiet tragedies do, with something beautiful. The bottle was no larger than a child's fist, its surface smooth as blown sugar, and tinted the faintest shade of amber. A gilt label wrapped itself around the glass like a ribbon, its lettering crisp, confident, and touched with the subtle flourish of a chemist who understood elegance. Bayer's heroin, it read in graceful script, for coughs, for nerves, for sleeplessness. Beneath the words, a pair of laurel branches curled together, as if crowning not a medicine but an accomplishment, something triumphant, refined, and unquestionably modern. To step into a Chicago pharmacy in those early years was to step into a place that smelled of mint, carbolic soap, and the faint sweetness of patent remedies. Frosted lamps cast a soft glow over polished counters. Glass jars filled with violet lozenges lined themselves like obedient soldiers against the walls. And beside the apothecary scales, gleaming beneath the gaslight, stood the newest marvel of the Gilded Age, heroin, the perfect tonic, the safe cousin of morphine, the jewel of German chemistry. The chemists presented it as if offering guests a jewel at a dinner party. Some lifted the bottle gently, as though touching a relic. Others handled it with brisk, professional pride. Its promise was irresistible relief without danger, calm without stupor, a cure that carried none of the scandal that clung so darkly to opium dens and laudanum bottles. Heroin was science purified, the respectable man's comfort, the noble woman's quiet helper, the mother's gentle remedy for a restless child. Even the way the liquid clung to the glass was seductive, thick and syrup-slow, catching the light like honey. When poured into a spoon, it shivered delicately, then settled into smooth stillness. This was not medicine that threatened. This was medicine that soothed beautifully, silently, insistently. Chicago, a city swelling with ambition and smoke, welcomed it without hesitation. In those first months, the bottle made its way into parlors, doctors' bags, dressing tables, and nightstands. Young mothers added a drop to warm milk to hush their infants' coughing fits. Clerks swallowed it before bed to still their nerves after long days beneath the clattering rail lines. Society women carried it in reticules decorated with velvet tassels, trusting it to quiet their hearts before opera performances or evening engagements. Even physicians, those cautious gatekeepers of the body's secrets, wrote prescriptions as swiftly as they shook hands, marveling at a remedy so gentle and so thoroughly civilized. Yet the bottle's golden shine carried a faint shadow, one too subtle for most to notice. Patients began returning early for refills, speaking with pleasant eagerness, touching the counter with restless fingertips. A soft dependency settled into their voices. "It helps so wonderfully, doctor. Just a bit more, if you will." But these were not the gaunt opium habitués who haunted cheap lodging houses. These were polished men and well-dressed women, their addictions still wrapped in silk and propriety. Heroin, the perfect cure, had made its home in the most respectable corners of the city. No outcry followed its arrival, no protest, no suspicion. A miracle had come, wrapped in gold and promise, and Chicago had opened its doors wide. The bottle quietly multiplied, appearing in medicine cabinets beside rosewater tonics, on writing desks beside fountain pens, in coat pockets beside crisp handkerchiefs. Even the most attentive observers mistook its growing presence for progress, another shimmering emblem of an age enamored with invention. But every miracle hides its own cost, and the cost of this one had only begun to glimmer beneath the lamplight. Dr. Nathaniel Harcourt had the sort of presence that soothed a room before he even spoke. Tall, immaculate, with a silver watch chain glinting against his waistcoat, he carried himself with the polished ease of a man who believed deeply in progress and who expected the world to admire it. His voice, low and warm, carried the softness of velvet. Patients often said they felt better the moment he addressed them, as though reassurance itself were a kind of medicine. In the early days of heroin's arrival in Chicago, it was Harcourt who championed it most fervently. He kept the first shipment behind his mahogany desk, not out of caution but pride. "A marvel," he murmured the first time he held the bottle to the light, watching the amber glow ripple across his office shelves. A clean cure at last. No risks, no vulgar opium dens, no trembling dependence. A new era for the practice of healing. His waiting room filled quickly that winter clerks with hoarse lungs from icy train yards, teachers worn thin by the long school term, businessmen plagued by sleeplessness and overwork. Women arrived too, wrapped in woolen cloaks, their cheeks pale with the exhaustion of endless social obligations and restless nights. Dr. Harcourt's manner never faltered. He listened with furrowed brow and sympathetic nod, his dark eyes steady as his patients unburdened themselves. And then, almost theatrically, he would reach for the bottle. "Just a teaspoon in warm water," he would say, pouring with unhurried precision. "You'll rest easily tonight. The nerves respond beautifully to it." The patients always relaxed as soon as he spoke. Some leaned forward, as if drawn nearer by the calm certainty in his tone. A few even smiled gratitude, softening their features at the idea that their discomfort had a dignified, effortless remedy. He handed them their first prescription with a reassuring pat on the hand. "Return next week, dear friend. We'll have you feeling yourself in no time." And they did return some earlier than expected. By January, Harcourt began noticing subtle changes. A lawyer who once visited every few months now appeared bi-weekly, hat in hand, a touch too eager as he spoke of renewed trouble sleeping. A seamstress who had always carried herself politely grew flustered when he suggested reducing her dosage. A stoic businessman, usually composed, trembled ever so slightly as he folded his prescription into his coat pocket. At first, Harcourt dismissed these details. "Winter strains us all," he told himself, adjusting his cuffs and moving briskly to his next appointment. But the unease settled in the corners of his mind, quiet yet persistent. Late at night, after his final patient had gone and the corridor lamps were dimmed, he would sit alone in his office, the golden-labeled bottle catching the faint glow of the street lamps outside. He traced a finger over the embossed letters, feeling an inexplicable tug of doubt. Could anything that worked so swiftly, so completely, be entirely without consequence? The following week, 3 of his patients returned within days of each other, their manners threaded with something urgency, perhaps, or a peculiar brightness in the eyes that didn't match their languid movements. One spoke too quickly, another too softly, and the third could barely look him in the eye as she whispered, "It helped so well, doctor. May I have a little more?" The velvet in Harcourt's voice thinned. He examined them carefully, more carefully than before. He noticed the same pinprick pupils, the same restless fingers, the same unnatural stillness beneath the surface of their polite composure. Something was shifting, something he had not anticipated. Yet when the next patient stepped into the room, shivering from the cold and coughing until her chest strained, Harcourt hesitated for only a heartbeat. Compassion and perhaps pride guided his hand as he reached once more for the bottle. "Just a teaspoon," he murmured, the velvet returning by force of habit. Outside his window, Chicago glowed with promise, unaware of the cracks beginning to form beneath its polished facade. And in Dr. Harcourt's office, the miracle cure continued its quiet, elegant spread. By the spring of that year, heroin had slipped so gently into Chicago's daily rhythms that one could scarcely remember a time before it. The pharmacies along State Street and Michigan Avenue displayed the bottles prominently now, their golden labels gleaming like miniature lanterns behind polished panes of glass. No single medicine had ever promised so much to so many, or with such elegance. It was the tonic that cured the city's restlessness. For the harried clerk hunched over ledgers in the dim backrooms of wholesale warehouses, heroin promised relief from the nightly cough stirred up by coal dust and damp air. A teaspoon in warm water, and the tightness around the ribs melted into something soft and forgiving. The tonic became his companion, discreetly tucked beside his inkstand, hidden from supervisors, yet always close at hand when the chest tightened too sharply. For the young mothers pale, sleep-deprived, endlessly in motion, heroin was a reassurance whispered into steaming cups of tea. When their infants cried through the night, when winter colds rattled tiny lungs, when exhaustion turned their thoughts sluggish and heavy, it was the doctor himself who recommended the tincture. "Perfectly safe," he had said with quiet authority. "Gentle for children, gentle for you." And, in a city where motherhood meant endurance long before it meant sentiment, who would refuse such ease? Factory workers relied on it too, though in a different way. After 12-hour shifts spent among clattering metal teeth and hissed steam valves, their nerves felt frayed, their hands trembling from strain. Heroin steadied those hands. It lulled their aching muscles into submission. It let them fall asleep, despite the phantom grinding of gears that still echoed in their ears. Even the aspiring artists of Chicago's burgeoning bohemian class embraced it with romantic enthusiasm. In smoke-filled rooms above taverns, painters and poets discovered that the tonic quieted their anxieties while amplifying their dreams. Words flowed more freely, brushstrokes felt more inspired. They praised it as a muse bottled by modern science, a potion that coaxed beauty from restlessness. But it was in the parlors of the well-to-do that heroin achieved its most refined triumph. At the grand townhouses along Prairie Avenue, dinners concluded not with cigars and liqueurs alone, but with delicate vials of the miracle tonic passed discreetly among the inner circle. Ladies dabbed tiny droplets onto sugar cubes before retiring for the evening, claiming it helped them maintain the serene composure expected of women of standing. Gentlemen, already burdened by the anxieties of business and investment, found that a measured dose softened the edges of their concerns, allowing them to meet each day with renewed poise. What set heroin apart from all other remedies was not merely its supposed versatility, it was the way it blended seamlessly into the rituals of the city. It required no guilt, no secrecy, no shame. Unlike the opium pipe or the laudanum vial, heroin carried none of society's old moral dread. It was clean, modern, respectable. It smelled faintly of sweet almond and something medicinally crisp. Its effects were swift, refined, undramatic. A tonic for the lungs, a tonic for the nerves, a tonic for grief, for sleeplessness, for the quiet ache that threaded through modern life. Chicago believed it at first, earnestly, completely, but as the weeks passed, small peculiarities began to emerge, too subtle for public alarm, but noticeable to those who looked closely. The clerk in the warehouse began returning for refills sooner, blaming the dust, though the winter storms had long passed. The young mother found her hands trembling slightly as she measured a dose for herself. The poet discovered that, without the tonic, inspiration shriveled into listlessness. No one spoke of these things aloud, not yet. To question the tonic was to question progress itself. To doubt it was to doubt science, modernity, and the shimmering promise of the new century. And so the city embraced it still warmly, blindly, gratefully, never imagining the quiet cost gathering beneath their very fingertips. Behind the frosted glass partition of Wexler and Sons Pharmacy, young Edwin Wexler learned more about the human condition than any classroom could have taught him. Barely 20, with sleeves perpetually dusted in powdered menthol and quinine, he spent his days measuring, grinding, and bottling remedies under the watchful gaze of his father. The elder Mr. Wexler believed deeply in precision. Every grain weighed, every tincture stirred exactly 13 times clockwise. Medicine, he often said, was trust rendered into liquid. But nothing prepared Edwin for the new golden-labeled bottle that arrived one grey morning wrapped in brown paper and tied with modest string. His father sliced the twine, unfolded the paper, and paused. For a moment, Edwin thought he saw something like admiration, perhaps even relief, cross the old man's features. "This," whispered Mr. Wexler, turning the bottle in his hands as though it were a relic unearthed from a sacred vault, "will change everything. Heroin." He pronounced the word with the same reverence reserved for life-saving antidotes or miraculous new antiseptics. At first, Edwin was charmed. The bottle felt warm in his hands, as if the amber liquid inside radiated its own quiet promise. Its scent soft, faintly sweet, almost floral, rose gently from the mouth of the vial each time he measured a dose. Compared to the bitter chalkiness of aspirin powders or the acrid tang of iodine, heroin seemed impossibly refined, clean, sophisticated. For weeks afterward, Edwin observed a new kind of customer emerge from the morning fog, one he had not noticed before. They were not the sickly nor the desperate, not the coughing labourers or feverish mothers. These were tidy men in starched collars, women with delicate gloves and polite smiles, bankers and teachers and polished clerks, people who did not ordinarily linger near the apothecary counter. They asked for heroin by name. Some did so in hushed voices, their glances flicking toward the frosted partition, as if expecting judgment. Others expressed relief, even gratitude, as they folded their prescriptions neatly into coat pockets. Many returned sooner than Edwin expected. One woman, pale, elegant, with a brooch shaped like a sea lily, came twice in a single week, apologizing each time for her persistent nerves. A lawyer visited so frequently that Edwin began preparing the dosage the moment he saw the man's silhouette approach through the window. At first, Mr. Wexler regarded this change with satisfaction. "A remedy of quality inspires loyalty," he declared, adjusting his spectacles as he observed the growing demand. "This is the future, Edwin. No more crude concoctions, no more unpredictable results." But Edwin noticed other things. The way customers' hands trembled ever so slightly as they waited, the faint shadows beneath their eyes, like smudges of soot from some internal fire, the strained breath they took when told their order would take a few minutes longer than usual, and always, that unmistakable flicker of urgency, carefully masked by polite smiles. One evening, as the lamps burned low and the shop was nearly closed, a young man stumbled in, cheeks flushed, coat askew. Edwin recognized him as a student from the conservatory nearby, a quiet boy who purchased cough syrups often, always with gentle apologies. But tonight his voice shook as he leaned across the counter. "Please," the boy whispered. "I need the tonic. I can't perform tomorrow without it." Edwin's stomach tightened. The request sounded less like a medical need and more like a confession. When he told his father, Mr. Wexler only sighed, polishing his spectacles with practiced calm. People rely on what heals them. It's natural. Yet Edwin sensed a tremor beneath the elder man's words, something unspoken, something uneasy. Behind the frosted glass partition, Edwin filled bottles with amber liquid long after the lamps should have been extinguished. And as he watched the golden remedy swirl into its glass vessels, he felt, for the first time, a shadow of doubt slip quietly into the room, thin, cold, and impossible to ignore. The tonic was changing his customers, and now it was beginning to change him. Chicago was a city that adored novelty, new towers rising from soot-darkened streets, new electric bulbs glowing like captured stars in the smoky twilight, new machines promising faster work and finer comforts. It was an age intoxicated by invention, and nothing delighted the Gilded Age imagination more than the idea of progress dressed in elegance. So when Heroin arrived, the city embraced it not merely as a medicine but as a symbol. Newspapers, always eager to celebrate modern miracles, rushed to declare it one of science's proudest triumphs. The morning editions carried trim columns bordered by decorative etchings of laurel leaves and apothecary flasks. A safer sedative, a modern cure for ancient afflictions, proclaimed the Chicago Tribune. A harmless relief for the nerves, announced the Daily Interocean. One publication even described it as the civilized man's answer to the vulgar vice of opium, a phrase that drifted through drawing rooms with the faintly smug cadence of moral superiority. Editors spoke glowingly of German laboratories, clean, bright places imagined as temples of careful science, where white-coated chemists refined nature's raw gifts into something pure. Heroin, they insisted, was no crude extract born of opium dens and shadowed alleys. It was a marvel of purification, a triumph of intellect over instinct, a bottled guarantee that modernity could conquer even the body's most capricious sufferings. Readers devoured these reports. They clipped articles, quoted passages at dinner parties, and folded the pages neatly into scrapbook volumes alongside advertisements for bicycles, corsets, phonographs, and other tokens of the bright new century forming just over the horizon. Stores capitalized instantly. Pharmacies redesigned their front windows, arranging heroin bottles like jewels atop mirrored shelves. Some paired them with delicate atomizers and imported soaps, creating displays that felt more like perfumeries than dispensaries. Others placed them beside brass scales and glass beakers to emphasize the medicine's scientific pedigree. Passers-by could scarcely ignore such glittering invitations. Soon enough, heroin was everywhere. In the parlors of Prairie Avenue mansions, gentlemen inventors boasted that Chicago would become the epicenter of safe, modern remedies, clean medicine, as they termed it, with a hint of disdain for the opium-tainted past. At social gatherings, women in silk gowns spoke of the tonic in the same breath as of fashionable teas and imported chocolates. Even clergymen, usually skeptical of chemical indulgence, remarked respectfully upon a medicine that promised relief without sin. A strange, soft fever overtook the city, not one of illness but of fascination. Heroin was discussed as though it were a new piece of art, or a novel electric device, or an unexpected gift of refinement bestowed upon a city determined to banish the rough edges of its frontier origins. People admired the bottle's golden label, the delicate syrup within, the dignified restraint of its effects. It felt like the future, and Chicago loved nothing more than the future. Yet within this fever of admiration, there were faint murmurs easily dismissed, barely noticeable, like dust motes drifting through a beam of light. A doctor in Hyde Park raised an eyebrow when several of his patients returned for their third prescription in as many weeks. A schoolteacher whispered to a colleague that one mother had begun sending her child to class unnaturally drowsy. A chemist in a small shop on the outskirts of the city quietly lowered his stock of heroin to a less conspicuous shelf after hearing unsettling rumors from colleagues. But these were isolated whispers against a roaring tide of praise. The fever grew, warm and seductive, unchallenged in its rise. For in this age of polished brass and grand ambition, Chicago believed wholeheartedly that progress could not betray it, that science had lifted humanity beyond its frailties, that the future would arrive without shadows. No one yet understood that some wonders glow brightest just before they burn. It was in the parlors of Chicago's well-appointed homes, those dim, velvet-draped chambers, where gaslight flickered like captured fireflies, that heroin made its most glamorous debut. Society had always adored a fashionable remedy, and nothing captivated the city's elite quite like the promise of a cure that was both modern and discreet. Thus, in homes where crystal decanters glittered beside ormolu clocks and heavy damask curtains muffled the city's industrial clamor, the miracle tonic found a stage. On a crisp March evening, Mrs. Adelaide Morland hosted one of her famed Thursday gatherings. Her home on Prairie Avenue was a cathedral of taste. Polished walnut floors, embroidered cushions, a pianoforte arranged beneath a portrait of her late husband, and a faint haze of perfume lingering in the air, violet, and something faintly medicinal. Rumor had already swept through the drawing rooms of the city. Adelaide possessed a new marvel, a tonic whispered about by doctors, praised in the newspapers, coveted by the fashionable. Guests arrived, wrapped in furs and silk, shedding the winter wind at the door. Servants glided between them with trays of silver-rimmed glasses. Laughter drifted from room to room, mingling with the soft notes of a waltz played by a young woman with pale hands. And in the center of this warmth and chatter stood a small table, draped in lace, upon which rested a single amber bottle. A golden label gleamed beneath the gaslight. Conversation slowed, eyes drifted toward the display. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. Others approached with the reverent curiosity usually reserved for rare jewels. "My friends," Adelaide began, her voice smooth as warmed honey, "I have recently come into possession of something quite extraordinary, a remedy so refined, so utterly modern, that I believe it will transform our understanding of well-being." She lifted the bottle with a gloved hand, letting the light strike its amber contents. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. "This," she continued, "is heroin, a gift from the laboratories of Europe. Gentle, safe, beautifully effective." She uncorked the bottle, and a faint, sweet scent rose into the air. The guests leaned forward. Adelaide's maid produced a tray of porcelain spoons, each with a square of sugar nestled upon it. With practiced elegance, Adelaide allowed a single drop to fall on each cube, the liquid catching the light like molten gold. "Just let it dissolve on the tongue," she instructed. "It is perfect for the nerves, perfect for sleep, perfect for the general unease that so often troubles us." The demonstration felt more like a ritual than a lesson. One by one, guests placed the sugar upon their tongues. They closed their eyes briefly, feeling the warmth spread through their limbs, a soft, deliberate calm, like silk being drawn over the mind. A hush fell over the parlor. Breaths slowed, shoulders relaxed. "It is remarkable," whispered a banker's wife, her voice drifting like a sigh. "I feel lighter already," murmured a young composer, tapping his cane absent-mindedly. Adelaide smiled a slow, knowing curve of the lips. "You see? A modern blessing." And so the ritual repeated itself in parlor after parlor across the city. Hosts unveiled heroin with a flourish. Guests partook with delighted astonishment. The tonic became a mark of cultural sophistication, something whispered about between sips of tea, something exchanged privately between friends in need of a moment's reprieve. But beneath the polished spectacle, subtle signs began to emerge. At such gatherings, some guests returned to the demonstration table sooner than others, lingering near the amber bottle with faint hunger in their eyes. A few asked quiet questions about purchasing their own supply. Others became unusually still as the evening wore on, their faces lit with an almost serene vacancy. Adelaide noticed this, though she told no one. Near the end of that first demonstration, she caught sight of her reflection in the parlour mirror, eyes slightly too bright, cheeks faintly flushed. And in that instant, a thin strand of unease threaded itself through her delight. Just as quickly, she smoothed her expression and turned back to her guests. They were laughing softly, their voices slowed to a gentle ripple, as if time itself had mellowed. The bottle gleamed once more beneath the chandeliers. Chicago's elite had found their new evening ritual, wrapped in lace, poured in amber, sweetened on sugar cubes, and the city, ever hungry for refinement, welcomed it with open hands. In the early weeks of Heroin's ascent, Chicago's physicians reported with satisfaction that winter coughs seemed easier to soothe than in seasons past. Patients who once hacked through December nights emerged from their sickbeds buoyed by the tonic's velvet calm. Parlours, once filled with the sharp bark of illness, grew quieter, their silence mistaken for recovery. And yet, if one listened closely, something unsettled lingered beneath that quiet, like an echo refusing to die. It began with small observations. A mother, clutching her shawl as she spoke to Dr. Harcourt, confessed that her son's cough returned whenever the medicine bottle emptied. "It vanishes the moment he takes the drops," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "But when the tonic is gone, the poor boy struggles again." Harcourt, still a firm believer in the remedy, assured her this was normal. Some afflictions, after all, required consistency. But the truth was stranger. The cough did not merely return. It clung. It hovered. It deepened. Not violently, as in pneumonia, nor with the rattling gasp of bronchitis. It was a delicate, persistent sound, soft, dry, and strangely hollow. Patients described it as a tickle, something like the whisper of dust in the throat. It interrupted sleep not with severity but with repetition, and always it eased miraculously after another spoonful of the amber tonic. Edwin Wexler noticed it most often among the shop's regular patrons. The lawyer, who once visited every 3 months, now appeared every 4 days, coughing lightly into a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. A schoolteacher arrived with the same complaint, describing it in a voice that wavered between embarrassment and needfulness. Even Mrs. Morland's refined friends, women with pearl buttons and immaculate gloves, approached the counter discreetly, their coughs disguised behind polite laughter. "I believe the winter air is harsher this year," one murmured, though the frost had already melted. "Yes, terribly harsh," another agreed, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter, betraying a nervous energy at odds with her otherwise composed demeanor. Edwin began cataloguing the pattern in the quiet loneliness of the shop's back room. Bottle returned, cough returns, tonic taken, cough vanishes, bottle empties, cough grows sharper. He watched the pattern repeat itself with almost mechanical precision. His father, cautious yet loyal to the new medicine, offered mundane explanations: dry air, city soot, lingering influenza. But even he could not entirely dismiss the unease that crept into Edwin's voice each evening as they locked the store and walked together through the dim glow of the gas lamps. At church the following Sunday, Edwin overheard whispers. An elderly man confessed that the tonic worked too well, so well I dare not stop it. A pair of seamstresses spoke softly about how their coughs had seemed to twist into something else, something dependent. Mothers debated proper dosages, though none admitted aloud the fear shimmering in their eyes. Still, no one blamed the tonic. Who could accuse something so gentle, so modern, so beautifully crafted. Instead, Chicago blamed the dampness of spring, the soot from the rail yards, the smoke that rolled in from the stockyards each dawn. People blamed anything but the amber bottle resting beside their beds. One evening, after closing the shop, Edwin lingered by the shelves. He lifted a bottle of heroin, holding it close to the lantern light. The syrup inside swayed with hypnotic slowness, catching the warm glow like captured sunshine. Beautiful, he thought. Too beautiful. He remembered the student from the conservatory, the trembling hands, the pale cheeks, the cough that sounded more like a plea than a symptom. He remembered the mother whose child slept unnaturally deeply after each dose. He remembered the banker who cleared his throat so frequently that his voice carried a faint rasp, as if his lungs longed for something they could not articulate. The cough had not left the city. It had merely changed its nature, becoming something quiet, insistent, and strangely attached to the miracle cure itself. In another age, someone might have recognized it as a warning, but in this era of polished brass and gilded optimism, Chicago mistook it for one more ailment to be calmed by a few more drops from the golden bottle. And so the cough lingered faithful, patient, and waiting. Long before heroin drifted into the parlors of Chicago's elite, the city's nurseries had already known long nights, nights of fretful infants, rattling coughs, and exhausted mothers pacing across creaking floorboards until dawn's pale light softened the windows. In these upper-floor rooms, muffled by velvet drapes and wallpaper printed with faded roses, even the wealthiest families found themselves humbled by the simple tyranny of a child who would not sleep. So when doctors began recommending a new, gentle tonic, perfectly harmless, they said, soothing for little lungs, the mothers welcomed it as a benediction. It entered the nurseries first as a whisper, a teaspoon in warm milk, a droplet smoothed onto a sugar cube, a dose administered with a silver spoon engraved with a christening date. The effect was so swift, so serene, that it felt like mercy. Infants who had coughed themselves breathless went quiet within minutes. Toddlers who sobbed from night terrors sank into slumber without a single whimper. Even the most restless children, those with wide, watchful eyes that refused to dim, softened into peaceful sleep under the tonic's warm spell. Nannies praised it silently, grateful for the rare nights when they could rest their own weary bodies on narrow attic beds. Mothers spoke of it with an almost superstitious reverence. "He finally sleeps," they would whisper to one another during afternoon visits, their voices blending with the soft ticking of mantel clocks. The tonic works miracles, no more crying, no more coughing. But as the weeks passed, subtle inconsistencies crept into those night-bound rooms. Children began sleeping too deeply. It was not the gentle slumber of a comforted child, but something heavier, more absolute. Their limbs lay slack against embroidered coverlets, their breaths turned shallow and faint, barely stirring the lace that draped the cradles. Some infants were difficult to rouse in the mornings, their eyelids fluttering with sluggish confusion. Nannies shook them gently, then a little harder, whispering their names into soft ears that did not respond as they once had. Still, no one dared question the miracle. After all, weren't children meant to sleep soundly? Yet other changes followed, changes so slight that only those who spent their days entirely within the nursery walls noticed. A thin sheen of sweat along a toddler's brow as he dozed, a faint bluish tint to an infant's lips, a tightening of small fingers around a blanket edge, even in sleep, a strange, cooing hum from a baby who no longer cried, as though dreaming in a language no one could interpret. Nanny Bridget O'Sullivan, who had tended children for 3 decades, sensed it before anyone else. She had seen fevers take little ones in the night and had soothed countless infants through storms and sickness. But this was different. "These little angels sleep as if they've wandered too far from waking," she murmured to Mrs. Morland one morning, her Irish lilt softened with unease. "It's not natural, ma'am. Not sleep something heavier." Mrs. Morland waved her concern away with a gloved hand. "The doctor assured me it is safe, and the newspapers praise it. You mustn't worry, Bridget. It is only the tonic doing its work." But Bridget was not convinced. One night, long after the household had settled, she crept into the nursery with a lantern. Its dim glow traced the outline of the sleeping children, cheeks flushed, lips parted, bodies unnervingly still. She listened closely. The silence pressed against her ears, dense and eerie, like standing in a church after everyone has gone. She knelt beside the cradle of the youngest child and whispered his name. He did not stir. Her breath caught, her pulse quickening. She touched his cheek. It was warm, but strangely damp. She lifted his tiny arm. It fell limply back onto the blanket with no resistance. "This isn't right," she whispered. "This isn't right at all." But morning came, and the child awoke with a faint smile, stretching his limbs lazily as though nothing had happened. Bridget found herself doubting her own intuition, her own memory, even her own fear. The tonic worked, didn't it? And so the night nurseries continued their strange transformation. Children slept. Mothers sighed with relief. Nannies prayed quietly. Above them, the golden-labeled bottle glimmered on a shelf, beautiful, silent, and dangerously beloved. Heroin had found its way into the city's most vulnerable rooms, and Chicago, blinded by gratitude, did not see the shadows slipping in behind it. Spring sunlight in Chicago had a peculiar way of softening even the city's hardest edges. It glinted off the river like molten brass, warmed the stone facades of new department stores, and turned the soot that drifted through the air into something glittering rather than grim. In that golden haze, the shopkeepers of State Street prepared their windows for the new season, cleaning the glass until it shone, polishing the mahogany trim, arranging their finest wares in careful, inviting tableau. And among these displays, nestled between imported soaps, pastel face powders, lavender-scented sachets, and glass jars of violet lozenges, stood the amber bottle that had taken Chicago by storm. Heroin. Its golden label caught the morning light with a delicate shimmer, like the gleam of jewelry or the sheen of silk. No other medicine displayed itself with such quiet pride. Most tonics hid behind counters or sat in neat rows on back shelves. But heroin demanded a place in the window. The shopkeepers claimed it was simply good business. After all, customers frequently asked for it. But beneath that practicality, something more subtle unfolded. It had become a symbol. At Wexler and Sons Pharmacy, Edwin felt an uneasy thrill as he arranged the display. He placed the heroin bottle onto a mirrored tray, flanked by mother-of-pearl spoons for measuring precise doses. Beside it, he set a crystal atomizer filled with rose water and a small stack of folded pamphlets bearing delicate blue etchings of European laboratories. The display gleamed with the promise of refinement medicine, not as necessity, but as luxury. Pedestrians paused before the window, their faces reflected faintly in the glass. Some leaned closer to read the label. Others nodded approvingly, recognizing the miracle cure that had graced newspaper columns and parlor conversations alike. A few customers even tapped the glass softly, signaling their admiration before entering the store. Across the city, similar windows told the same story. At Rittman's apothecary, the heroin bottles stood beside violet-tinted cough syrups and silver-plated inhalers. At the fashionable Westlake chemist on Michigan Avenue, a lace doily had been placed beneath the bottle to emphasize its elegance. Even the modest neighborhood shops, those cramped little rooms smelling of camphor and chalk, found ways to elevate their displays, draping the heroin bottles in soft cloth or placing them on raised pedestals like rare treasures. The message was unmistakable. This was not a medicine to be hidden. This was progress bottled, polished, and illuminated for all to admire. Yet Edwin noticed something the shopkeepers did not. As the days grew warmer, Familiar faces began lingering at the window long after they should have moved on. The young lawyer, already too pale for his age, pressed his fingers lightly to the glass before stepping inside. A seamstress he recognized hovered uncertainly outside, watching the bottle with a hunger she tried and failed to disguise. Even mothers pushing prams paused, their eyes flicking not to their children, but to the amber glow on the window's center shelf. It was as though the bottle exerted a magnetic pull. Children, too, pointed at the display, drawn by its brightness, by the way sunlight danced through the syrup inside. One afternoon, Edwin overheard a little girl ask her mother, "Is it candy?" The mother laughed lightly, though her voice trembled. "No, darling, it's medicine. Very good medicine." The girl looked unconvinced. On particularly bright mornings, the syrup inside the bottle gleamed so warmly that Edwin had to look away. It fascinated him, the way something so beautiful could evoke both admiration and dread. The more he worked with it, the more he sensed the contradiction, the quiet danger disguised beneath golden charm. One evening, just after closing, he lingered by the window. The street lamps glowed softly outside. Their reflection shimmered across the glass, making the heroin bottle appear almost haloed. He imagined the customers who would come tomorrow. He imagined their coughs, their trembling hands, their too bright smiles. He imagined the way they would glance at the bottle before they glanced at him, as though all their hopes, perhaps even their survival, were sealed behind that golden label. A breeze rattled the window lightly, as if the city itself shivered. Behind the glass, the bottle remained perfectly still, gleaming with a promise Chicago had accepted far too eagerly. Beautiful, beguiling, and quietly, terribly persuasive. For months, Chicago drifted beneath the soft, narcotic haze of admiration. Heroin had threaded itself through drawing rooms, pharmacies, nurseries, and factory floors with such effortless grace that few could imagine life before it. It was a remedy that promised ease, and so the city accepted it gratefully, unquestioningly. Only as spring edged towards summer did the first murmurs of doubt begin to surface. Fragile as cobwebs and just as easily brushed aside. They began not with alarm but with unease. Dr. Harcourt was among the first to notice. He had always prided himself on the calm efficiency of his practice, the smooth procession of patients, the quiet gratitude in their faces as they departed. Yet now his consultations acquired a faint edge, like a dissonant note in a familiar melody. Patients arrived earlier than their appointments, sitting rigidly in the waiting room with fixed smiles and restless hands. Their voices, once composed, carried a tremor beneath their courteous greetings. One woman, Mrs. Forsyth, whose delicate constitution had long been the subject of society gossip, returned to his office 3 times in 10 days. "It helps wonderfully, doctor," she assured him, though her eyes were too bright, her cheeks too hollow. "But I feel somehow unsettled when the effects fade. The cough returns, the nerves return. A bit more would set me right." Harcourt resisted the urge to pull back, to deny her request outright. Instead, he offered a tempered prescription, his voice gentle but firm. She accepted it with a nervous laugh that lingered long after she left the room. At Wexler and Sons Pharmacy, Edwin observed the same pattern with growing dread. Bottles that should have lasted weeks were returned empty within days. Customers leaned over the counter with polite desperation, as though confessing a private shame. "I know it's meant to be taken sparingly, young man," an elderly clerk murmured one morning, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. "But I fear my lungs crave it now, more than I expected." Edwin's father, Mr. Wexler, overheard the remark and stiffened, though he kept his expression composed. "The body grows accustomed to what soothes it," he replied evenly. "Nothing unusual." But later, when the shop was quiet, Edwin found him lingering before the heroin display, staring at the amber bottle with a frown etched deeper than usual. Even the nurses in the city's hospitals felt the shift. They noticed that patients who had been given heroin for post-operative pain now requested it with unnatural urgency. They watched as mild coughs seemed to deepen, as wounds healed more slowly, as once stoic men begged softly for just another dose to help them rest. Some nurses whispered to each other in the dim lamplight of long corridors. "It calms them too deeply," one murmured, "and yet they cannot seem to do without it." Rumors drifted like faint draughts through the social circles of Prairie Avenue. A mother confessed to a friend that her infant slept so soundly it frightened her. A schoolteacher mentioned that 3 parents had recently asked where to buy the tonic in larger quantities. A widow admitted she no longer needed it for her grief, yet reached for it anyway, for comfort. And then there were the dreams. Several patients reported strange, vivid visions after taking the tonic, floating sensations, muted colors, voices that echoed long after waking. Some described them with wonder, others with dread. But all shared a peculiar detail. When the dream faded, they felt hollowed out, as though some essential part of themselves had drifted a little too far from shore. None of this amounted to proof. Nothing yet resembled a crisis. Heroin remained a marvel in the public mind, a scientific gift, a modern luxury, a cure wrapped in gold. The city was too enamored, too proud, too convinced of its own progress to suspect true danger. And so the warnings remained quiet, small, dismissed, a quiver in a doctor's voice, a tremor in a pharmacist's hand, a shadow in a mother's eyes as she watched her child sleep too still, too deep. Chicago was beginning to stir in its dream, but not yet to wake, for the golden bottle still gleamed on every shelf, whispering its promise of relief. And the city, fearing its return to restlessness, clung to that promise with both hands. Winter returned to Chicago with its usual severity winds that scraped along the lakefront like icy blades, street lamps dimmed by drifting snow, and soot-darkened rooftops collecting frost as though the city wore a crown of cold iron. Yet something subtle had changed. The season felt quieter than years past, as if a hush had settled over the city, not born of snow, but of something heavier, something distilled and bottled. Heroin had softened Chicago's voice. In the tenements of Halstead Street, the usual coughs and wails that echoed through thin walls grew strangely muted. The mothers there, already worn threadbare by labor and poverty, had discovered the tonic through charity doctors who carried it in their black bags like a miracle for the masses. Children who once cried from hunger or sickness now slept long hours wrapped in patched blankets, their breaths shallow and rhythmic. Neighbors commented on the peace, mistaking silence for comfort. In the boarding houses near the stockyards, the young men, strong, soot-stained, exhausted, took the tonic for sleeplessness and aching joints. Where once they played cards, smoked pipe tobacco, or argued spiritedly into the night, now they sat still, their conversations gentler, their laughter dampened into something like faint murmurs. They walked the halls a little slower, spoke a little softer, and slept with unnerving depth. Even the city's taverns, usually roaring with winter revelry, felt strangely subdued. Patrons gathered in warm corners but spoke in murmured tones, as if some unseen force pressed its finger to their lips. Bartenders noticed the change. Men who once demanded whiskey at closing time now left early, seeking the quiet comfort of a spoonful of the amber remedy at home. The transformation was most striking among the city's refined classes. Along Prairie Avenue, the Morlands, the Belgraves, the Van Dornes, and other prominent families moved through their nightly routines with unusual tranquility. Heroin had become their secret bulwark against the season's gloom. A teaspoon before bed, a drop stirred into warm milk, a sugar cube delicately laced with golden syrup. Their servants observed the shift, the hush that fell over parlors after dinner, the way their employers drifted through rooms like candle flames flickering low. Servants spoke of voices softened to the point of inaudibility, of footsteps slowed, of conversations that faded into long, heavy silences broken only by the ticking of clocks. One maid, Anna, tended to Mrs. Belgrave, a woman whose sharp tongue and constant demands had once made the household tremble. But that winter, Mrs. Belgrave's voice softened to a whisper. She asked for nothing save the tonic. She sat for hours in a velvet armchair, eyes half-lidded, murmuring comments that slipped into incoherence before the maid could fully hear them. Anna, unnerved, mentioned this to the head butler. "The winter affects her nerves," he replied, though he avoided her gaze. Downtown, at Wexler and Sons Pharmacy, customers no longer engaged in lively conversation while waiting for their prescriptions. The air remained tinged with the usual scents: menthol, camphor, lilac powder. But the voices had changed. Requests were spoken in soft, trembling tones, as though the patrons feared startling something perched invisibly upon their shoulders. Mr. Wexler himself noticed it one frigid morning as snow piled against the shop's entrance. A group of well-dressed women entered together, their veils dusted with frost. They spoke in hushed, trembling voices, asking for the tonic with the same solemnity as one might request last rites. Their hands shook as they handed over their coins. Their eyes flicked toward the bottle with a longing too fragile to disguise. "It is the cold," he reassured himself, yet the words felt hollow. By January, the city seemed to operate under an unspoken spell. Streetcars moved through snow-muffled streets, more quietly. Factories, though still roaring, felt strangely subdued in their workers' demeanor. The very rhythm of the city, its pulses, its murmurs, its noises, seemed wrapped in cotton, as if softened by an invisible fog. Only a few people truly understood what they were witnessing, though none dared voice it plainly. Chicago was not resting. It was sedated, and the winter, with its soft white hush, merely masked the truth of it. The tonic's sweetness had seeped too deeply into the city's bloodstream. Voices had grown gentle, hands had grown dependent. And beneath the velvet calm, something darker began to stir, quiet, as a heartbeat muffled beneath thick blankets of snow. Constable Henry Whitlock was not a man easily unsettled. Broad-shouldered, steady, and wrapped each winter in a thick navy greatcoat that smelled faintly of wool and pipe smoke, he had patrolled LaSalle Street for nearly 15 years. He knew its rhythms the way a sailor knows the sea, its bright mornings full of foot traffic, its bustling noon hours filled with clerks, lawyers, and messengers, its quiet evenings when the glow of gas lamps softened the hard edges of the financial district. But during that peculiar winter, something on LaSalle Street felt wrong. At first, Whitlock could not pinpoint it. The street was calmer. Yes, less shouting from delivery boys, fewer quarrels near taverns, fewer drunken missteps spilling onto streetcar tracks. It was as though the city had collectively lowered its voice. But beneath that quiet lay an odd tension, like the suffocating stillness that precedes a storm. One night, as snow drifted down in soft spirals, Whitlock noticed a man standing beneath a lamp-post outside the marble bank building. The fellow was neatly dressed, a well-to-do office clerk, judging by the crisp collar and polished boots. But he stood too still, staring at nothing, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. Whitlock approached. "Evening, sir. Everything all right?" The man turned slowly. His eyes were glassy, pupils pinprick small despite the darkness. His voice, when it emerged, was barely more than a whisper. Yes, officer. Just catching my breath." But the man did not breathe with any urgency. His chest rose shallowly, his hands trembling in a faint, rhythmic twitch. Whitlock lingered after the man drifted away, walking with an eerie, drifting gait, as though some invisible thread pulled him forward by the sternum. 2 nights later, Whitlock saw it again. A young woman no older than 20 sat on the steps of the old courthouse, her gloved hands pressed to her lips. She rocked gently, eyes fixed on the streetcar tracks, her face pale with a dreamlike vacancy. When Whitlock touched her shoulder, she startled violently, then offered a thin, wavering smile. "I'm quite all right, officer. Just tired." Her words slurred, though not from drink. A small amber bottle glimmered inside her reticule. Whitlock frowned. He had seen the same bottle in the coat pocket of the clerk beneath the lamppost. He had seen it in the hand of a factory foreman slumped behind his warehouse late at night, and he had noticed it peeking from the purse of a socialite he helped into a carriage, her fingers clutching it with the desperation of someone drowning who had found driftwood. Heroin. He had heard the name whispered approvingly by doctors, praised in newspaper columns. A miracle cure, they called it. A remedy that soothed the lungs, quieted the nerves, softened the harshness of city life. He had not questioned it. He was a policeman, not a man of science. But now he began to wonder. Over the next week, more incidents surfaced. A bookkeeper fainted on the sidewalk, his pulse sluggish and faint. A trolley operator was found in a storage closet, sitting upright and unresponsive, his pocket heavy with a golden-labeled vial. A mother wandered LaSalle in her nightdress, searching for her child, though the child was safe at home, sleeping too deeply under a nanny's watchful eye. Whitlock carried these memories with him like stones in his coat pockets. One evening, as he patrolled past the tall granite facade of the federal building, he encountered Dr. Harcourt himself. The physician looked elegant as ever, but his expression held an unfamiliar strain. "Evening, Doctor," Whitlock said, tipping his cap. "You been seeing more unusual cases lately?" Harcourt hesitated long enough for Whitlock to notice. "Some," he replied softly, "but Chicago is under considerable strain this winter. People tire easily, they grow fragile." Whitlock's brows knit. "It's the tonic, isn't it? That new medicine everyone's carrying." Harcourt exhaled an exhale that revealed more truth than his words. "It helps them," he insisted, though his eyes flickered downward. "It must help them." But Whitlock heard the doubt beneath the velvet tone. In the quiet nights that followed, Chicago seemed to drift deeper into its strange slumber. Footsteps softened, voices dulled, faces blurred into pale, trembling shadows illuminated by the street lamp's cold glow. Constable Whitlock stood watch on LaSalle Street, feeling the city shifting beneath his boots, subtle, dangerous, and strangely silent. It was no longer the winter's cold that unsettled him. It was the hush. It was the drifting. It was the golden bottle appearing in more hands than he could count. And as he walked his beat through the falling snow, he could not shake the dread building slowly in his chest. Chicago wasn't growing calmer. It was falling under a spell. Harold Lyman had always been a model of quiet discipline. A junior clerk at the reputable firm of Dayton and Merrick, he arrived punctually each morning, his collar neatly pressed, his hair parted with the precision of a man who feared disorder. His desk sat near the window overlooking Monroe Street, where winter sunlight fell in thin, chilling beams across his ledgers. For years, Harold had filled column after column with unerring neatness, numbers aligned like obedient soldiers, handwriting crisp and unwavering. But the winter heroin arrived in Chicago. Something in Harold began to fray. It began innocuously enough. A persistent cough, born of the drafty stairwell in his boarding house, had plagued him for weeks. A colleague recommended the new tonic that worked miracles, and Harold, mild-mannered, trusting, visited Wexler and Sons one icy afternoon. The first dose felt like stepping into warm water. His lungs loosened. The cough dissolved like sugar on the tongue. His thoughts, once tight and overworked, drifted into gentle clarity. That evening he slept soundly, so soundly that he forgot what it felt like to wake in pain. By the third day, the tonic became part of his routine. By the second week, it became the routine. Harold's co-workers noticed the change before he did. He moved more slowly through the office, as though wading through syrup. His eyes, once keen and attentive, took on a distant sheen. He smiled more often, true, but the smiles came at strange times while balancing ledgers, while standing in empty hallways, while staring at nothing in particular. And then there was the matter of the meals. Harold had never been a hearty eater, but he had always taken his luncheon at precisely 11:45, carrying a small parcel of bread and cheese wrapped in wax paper. But one morning, the parcel remained untouched. By noon, it sat unopened on the corner of his desk, paper edges curling. "You're not hungry today, Harold?" asked Mr. Merrick, passing by with a folder under his arm. Harold blinked, as though startled out of a dream. "Hungry?" he murmured. "No, not quite. The tonic keeps me well." He said the words earnestly, almost gratefully. The next day, he forgot his breakfast entirely. By the week's end, his colleagues noticed that his cheeks had hollowed slightly, and his collar hung more loosely around his neck. Still, Harold insisted he felt wonderfully at ease. The tonic soothed him, sustained him. Hunger seemed a distant inconvenience. One afternoon, Miss Evelyn Hart, a typist known for her sharp perception, approached Harold's desk. "You've barely touched your lunch in days," she said quietly. "You ought to eat something." Harold lifted his head slowly, his pupils narrowing beneath the gaslit glow. "Food feels unnecessary lately," he replied with a placid smile. "The tonic keeps me steady. It brightens the day." Miss Hart's brow furrowed. She had heard others speak this way softly, dreamily, as though half living within the warm fog of some unseen veil. Later that evening, as she gathered her papers, she glanced once more at Harold. He sat motionless, hand resting lightly on his ledger, staring through the window at the drifting snow. His untouched lunch sat beside him, forgotten. "Harold?" she called gently. He did not hear her. Only after she placed a hand on his shoulder did he stir suddenly, inhaling sharply as though pulled from deep water. "I'm sorry," he whispered, blinking rapidly. "I must have drifted." Miss Hart watched him with growing dread. Drifted, the word echoed in her mind. 2 days later, Harold collapsed. He had risen from his desk too quickly, reaching for a file atop a cabinet. His vision blurred, knees buckled, and he fell forward, striking the edge of the desk before crumpling onto the floor. Gasps filled the office as co-workers rushed to help him. His pulse fluttered weakly. His breath came in faint, uneven threads. When the physician arrived, Harold stirred only long enough to whisper, "The tonic. I only need the tonic." Those words chilled Miss Hart to her core. Later, as Harold was carried out on a stretcher, pale and trembling, she noticed something on his desk, a golden-labeled bottle, half empty, glimmering under the pale winter sun. Heroin had taken Harold's hunger. It had taken his rest. It had taken his clarity. And now, though none dared say it aloud, it was beginning to take Harold himself. In the growing quiet of Chicago's soft-voiced winter, he was merely one of the first. But he would not be the last. Chicago's music halls had always pulsed with vibrant life. Even in the harshest winters, their doors spilled warm lamplight onto icy sidewalks, beckoning passers-by with the promise of respite, an evening of song, clinking glasses, and the sweet escape of performance. Inside, velvet seats cradled the city's elite while gas chandeliers shimmered overhead, illuminating gilded balconies and polished instruments waiting to be coaxed into brilliance. But by the winter, when heroin drifted through the city like a seductive fog, a different kind of glow began to emanate from those halls, not from the chandeliers, but from the performers themselves. It began with subtle changes. The orchestra's violinists, usually taut with nerves before concerts, appeared unusually serene backstage. Their hands no longer shook as they tightened bowstrings. Their breathing, once quick and scattered, became slow and syrup-thick. A soft, dreamy smile played upon their lips as they waited for the conductor's cue. And when they played, the music came out warm, languid, almost hypnotic, as though each note had been dipped in honey before reaching the air. Singers, too, discovered the tonic. A teaspoon before rehearsal, they claimed, steadied their vibrato and eased the tightness in their throats. Sopranos floated through arias with a new, velvet softness that enraptured audiences. Tenors, usually plagued by pre-performance jitters, delivered love-struck verses with unnatural calm. The applause that followed felt richer, prolonged, almost as if the audience sensed they were witnessing something rare and otherworldly. Yet beneath the gold-dusted surface of their artistry, something troubling stirred. Miss Lillian Graves, a rising star whose voice had earned comparisons to angels in cathedral niches, began arriving earlier and earlier each night. Not to warm up, but to swallow a measured spoonful of heroin in the solitude of her dressing room. Her hand would tremble slightly as she uncorked the bottle, though her voice during performances never betrayed the faint tremor. She sang with breathtaking tranquility, as if hovering somewhere between waking and dreaming. But afterward, she moved strangely. Her fellow performers noticed her drifting through the backstage corridor as though in a trance, her pupils narrowed to pinpoints, her face shimmering with an unnatural flush. She often forgot to remove her stage jewelry, stepping into the street still wearing rhinestone earrings or a glittering choker. One night, a stagehand found her standing motionless behind the velvet curtain, long after the hall had emptied, staring at the ghostly glow of gas lamps reflected in the polished floor. "I feel lighter," she confessed once, her voice soft as falling ash. "As though I am singing from a place inside myself that doesn't hurt anymore." Her friend, the pianist Mr. Avery Linton, felt a chill crawl along his spine at her words. For he, too, had tried the tonic, and he, too, knew the peculiar clarity it brought, the way it erased fear, silenced doubts, smoothed the jagged edges of the mind. But he also felt the other side of it, the hollow ache that returned once the warmth faded, the sudden heaviness in his limbs, the yearning that whispered, just a little more, just enough to feel whole again. In the orchestra pit, the cellists sometimes lost track of their measures. The flautists breathed too slowly between phrases. The conductor, normally sharp and commanding, began swaying gently to the beat as though lulled by his own music. Audiences noticed only the beauty. Critics wrote that Chicago was experiencing a season of transcendence, that performances carried a new depth, a strange and captivating serenity. They praised the musicians for their discipline, unaware that many could no longer perform without the amber bottle hidden among their sheet music. Behind the stage, gas lamps flickered, casting shadows that swayed like dancers against the walls. The air carried the faint scent of resin, perfume, and something sweeter, something medicinal. One evening, after an especially haunting performance, Miss Graves collapsed in the wings. She sank gracefully to the floor, like a marionette gently released, her breath shallow, her heartbeat fluttering beneath her corset. The golden bottle rolled from her trembling hand, spilling a drop of syrup onto the floorboards. The stage lights dimmed, the applause faded, and in the faint glow of the hallway, the truth shimmered. The music hall glow was not brilliance alone. It was dependence, delicate, growing, and oh so beautifully disguised. And Chicago, entranced by the performances, applauded louder still, unaware that each ovation pulled its performers deeper into a dream from which they could not easily wake. The factories of Chicago were kingdoms of iron and steam, vast cavernous halls where gears roared, pistons shuddered, and belts spun with tireless fury. Even in winter, the air inside those places was thick and warm, saturated with the scent of oil and the metallic tang of machinery. Men labored shoulder to shoulder, faces smudged with soot, shirts damp with sweat despite the chill clawing at the city outside. Work demanded alertness, precision, and strength. A single misstep could cost a limb or a life. And so, When heroin drifted into the city like a golden whisper, the workers embraced it eagerly. A spoonful before dawn eased stiff joints. A drop after lunch softened the ache in weary muscles. It dulled the nerves, quieted the constant hum of anxiety, and most seductive of all, made the endless clatter of machines feel almost rhythmic, almost peaceful. For men who spent 12 hours a day navigating danger, the tonic felt like armor, until it wasn't. Samuel Harnett had worked at the Halberd & Sons Metalworks for 9 years. Reliable, calm, and known for his steady hands, he operated one of the large stamping machines, an enormous iron beast that came crashing down with a sound like thunder, flattening sheets of metal into precise shapes. No man in the factory knew the machine better than Samuel, and no man respected it more. But that winter, Samuel's hands began to tremble. He blamed the cold at first, then the long hours. Then he blamed nothing at all, because the tonic made everything feel manageable again. He kept a bottle tucked discreetly inside his coat, wrapped in cloth to keep it from breaking. A single dose steadied him. A second erased the nervous quiver entirely. By the third, he felt enveloped in a warm, floating calm that made even the screech of metal feel distant. His co-workers noticed the change. Samuel, once meticulous, began losing track of his measurements. He paused longer between tasks. He stared too long at the machinery, as though listening to a lullaby only he could hear. "Sam, you all right?" asked Jacob Price, a broad-shouldered man who worked beside him. Samuel blinked slowly. "Never better," he murmured. "Just peaceful." But machines do not wait for peacefulness. One morning, while snow battered the factory windows in frantic gusts, Samuel took a dose of heroin before stepping into the metalworks hall. The warmth spread through him like liquid amber. His muscles loosened, his breath slowed, and the roar of machinery softened to a pleasant hum. The world seemed dipped in velvet, gentle, golden, unthreatening. He approached the stamping machine with his usual tools, but his mind drifted, his gaze unfocused. The rhythm of the piston's rise and fall, normally a warning, seemed almost soothing. Jacob glanced over just in time to see Samuel's hand slip beneath the press. There was a split second, a breath, a heartbeat when the world seemed to freeze. Then the machine came down. The sound was sickening, a sharp crack swallowed by the relentless clang of the metalworks. Samuel screamed, staggering backward as crimson splattered across the polished steel. Workers rushed forward, shouting, cursing, calling for help. Someone shut down the machine. Someone else wrapped a tourniquet around Samuel's mangled hand. Through the chaos, Samuel's eyes fluttered, unfocused, as though waking from a dream he had not meant to enter. I didn't see it," he whispered, voice trembling. It was so quiet, everything felt so quiet. The foreman, pale beneath his soot-stained skin, spotted the bottle in Samuel's coat pocket. He recognized the golden label instantly. He had seen the same bottle in the pockets of half his crewmen who seemed calmer lately, yes, but slower, softer, dangerously dulled. The factory doctors said little. The owners said even less. The accident was recorded, the machine cleaned, the floor scrubbed, but among the workers, whispers spread like sparks in dry straw. Sam wasn't himself. Saw him drift in last week. That tonic, it ain't right. Yet no one stopped taking it. The ache of labor was too great and the relief too seductive. The men swallowed their fear along with their doses. In the days that followed, Samuel did not return to the factory. His hand was ruined, shattered beyond repair. And though the others spoke of him with sympathy, some avoided his quiet boarding room, afraid not only of his injury, but of seeing themselves in his hollowed eyes. For the accident revealed something none wanted to admit. Heroin dulled pain. Heroin dulled fear. Heroin dulled caution. But on the factory floor, a dulled man was a doomed man. and the winter of soft voices grew a shade more dangerous. In the upper floors of Chicago's hospitals, those tall, drafty buildings whose corridors smelled faintly of carbolic acid and steam heat, the women's wards were often the quietest spaces. Pale daylight filtered through high windows with frosted panes, softening the harshness of white-tiled walls. Here, nurses in stiff uniforms glided between iron-framed beds, their footsteps muffled by the hush of convalescence. Yet that winter, a new kind of silence settled over the women's wards. Not the peaceful quiet of healing, but something heavier, something that felt woven into the very air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Heroin had made its way here, too prescribed to soothe postpartum pains, calm nervous fits, relieve the exhaustion of childbirth, and steady the frayed minds of women worn thin by hardship, grief, or sleepless nights. Many who entered the wards sick or anxious found instant comfort in the tonic's warm, floating calm. At first, the nurses welcomed the change. Patients who once sobbed or thrashed in fever now slept with serene stillness. Those who had wailed through contractions now lay with softened features, their bodies slack with relief. Even the most troubled cases, women suffering from melancholia, hysteria, or the lingering shadows of trauma, lay quiet as drifting snow. But as the days passed, the nurses began to notice unsettling patterns. It was Nurse Margaret Doyle, the most experienced of the staff, who voiced the first concern. She was tall, sharp-minded, and carried herself with the somber authority of a woman who had witnessed every form of suffering the wards had to offer. One morning, she pulled aside the young trainee nurse, Clara. "Observe them closely," Margaret said quietly. "Their stillness isn't natural." Clara frowned. "They're resting, Miss Doyle." The doctor said the tonic. "The tonic," Margaret interrupted, "has softened them too deeply." She gestured toward Mrs. Langley, a new mother whose child lay swaddled beside her in a wicker cradle. Her eyelids fluttered faintly, but her arms lay limp, palms upturned. Her breath came shallow, barely stirring the lace at her collar. The infant slept too, but with the same odd heaviness, as though mirroring the mother's unnatural slumber. Margaret lowered her voice. "I roused her twice this morning. Each time she looked at me as if from a dream she couldn't quite leave." In the bed nearby, another patient, Miss Doreen Hawthorne, lay with a faint sheen of perspiration on her brow. Though her treatments had ended days earlier, she begged for the tonic with trembling urgency. "Just a spoonful," she whispered whenever a nurse passed. "I feel so much calmer with it, so much better. Please, only a little more." Her tone was soft, too soft, yet threaded with an unmistakable longing. The doctors dismissed the nurse's worries with condescending smiles. "It is exhaustion," they insisted. "Female nerves. The natural fragility of their sex." But the nurses knew better. They saw the signs during night rounds when gas lamps flickered along silent hallways. They saw pupils shrunk to pinpoints, fingers twitching, lips parted with shallow breaths. Women who once demanded attention now lay passive, vacant, drifting somewhere far from the waking world. Worst of all were the mornings when a patient would awaken and, before asking for water or breakfast, quietly request the tonic, her voice fragile but urgent. The whispers spread among the nursing staff. "Mrs. Kavanagh forgot her own baby's name yesterday." Miss Emery stared at the wall for an hour, claiming she saw colours moving under the paint. Mrs. Brooks fainted after a single dose, her pulse slowed to nothing I've ever seen. Nurse Margaret began keeping her own notes, observations, scrawled inside a small leather book she hid beneath her apron. She recorded every detail, the drifting gazes, the shallow breathing, the unsteady return to consciousness. She even sketched a diagram of the tonic's effects on one patient's pulse across several days. One evening, as snow whipped violently against the windows, she stood alone at the foot of the ward, lantern in hand. The women slept, dozens of them still, pale and unnervingly silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of the radiator, breathing warmth into the room like a sleeping beast. "It quiets them too much," she whispered to herself. "Quiets them in ways that feel unnatural." Clara approached her timidly. "Should we speak to the superintendent?" Margaret shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the beds. "Not until we understand more. But something is wrong here, terribly wrong." Outside, the snowstorm howled, but inside the ward, peace lay like a shroud, soft, heavy, and deceptive. The women slept, the babies slept, and in the golden-labeled bottles lined neatly in the medicine cabinet, the syrup glowed faintly under lamplight, beautiful, seductive, and tightening its hold on the most vulnerable souls in Chicago. The nurses' whispers grew louder in the coming weeks. But the city, wrapped in its winter dream, was not ready to listen. Dr. Nathaniel Harcourt had built his reputation on composure. Even in the most dire medical crises, his hands moved with a steady precision that reassured patients and nurses alike. Colleagues often remarked that nothing rattled him, not the screams of fevered children, not the pale ghosts of influenza survivors, not even the quiet confessions of the city's most desperate souls. But that winter, something began to gnaw at the edges of his calm. It started as a whisper of unease, a flicker of doubt whenever he uncorked the golden-labeled bottle on his desk. His patients swore the tonic worked wonders, soothing nerves, easing pain, granting restful sleep. And yet, they returned with alarming regularity, eyes bright and hollow, voices softened to trembling threads. Night after night, Harcourt found himself replaying their faces in his mind. Mrs. Forsyth's trembling hands, Mr. Talbot's pinprick pupils, Miss Addison's drifting speech. Each detail pressed itself into his memory like a fingerprint he could not wipe away. Soon, sleep became a fickle companion. He would lie awake in his darkened townhouse, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond his window, the distant clatter of late-night carriages, the thin whistle of wind slipping through the eaves. The silence pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. He would close his eyes, only to see again the pale stillness of the women's wards, the trembling desperation of his patients, the empty gaze of the clerk who had collapsed on Monroe Street. And always, always behind these visions hovered the golden glow of the heroin bottle. One night, after hours spent tossing beneath heavy blankets, Harcourt rose from bed and lit the small lamp on his nightstand. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror across the room, eyes shadowed, hair disheveled, the mask of composure slipping. He reached for the bottle. It felt strangely warm in his hands, as though the syrup within carried its own quiet life. For weeks, he had prescribed it with unwavering confidence. For days, he had feared its consequences. Now, for the first time, he considered taking it himself, not out of curiosity, but out of exhaustion. "A single spoonful," he murmured to the empty room. "To rest, to think clearly." He poured a small measure into a silver spoon. The syrup shimmered, thick and luminous, catching the lamplight in a soft halo. His hand trembled as he raised it to his lips. The effect was immediate. Warmth spread through him, a gentle, enveloping calm that softened every nerve. His breath slowed, his heartbeat settled. The restlessness that had haunted him for nights dissolved like sugar in hot tea. He felt a floating sensation, as though lying upon warm water, drifting without direction or weight. For the first time in weeks, sleep found him. But the morning brought no relief. Harcourt awoke groggy, his limbs heavy, his mind clouded. The warmth of the night before had vanished, replaced with a dull ache behind his eyes and a lingering sense of disorientation. He reached instinctively for the bottle but froze. His hand hovered above it, fingers trembling. He had tasted the danger firsthand. Throughout the day, his practice felt different. He watched his patients more closely. He studied their faces, their movements, their eagerness for the remedy he had once prescribed so casually. Each request for the tonic now struck him like a warning bell. In the afternoon, a frail woman named Mrs. Leary entered his office, clutching her shawl. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice thin with longing, "my cough has returned. I need more of the tonic." Harcourt hesitated. She noticed. "Please," she added softly, "it helps me so much." He opened his medical ledger, but his pen hovered motionless above the page. He could still feel the residue of last night's dose thick in his chest, lingering like a shadow. For the first time since the tonic had swept through Chicago, Dr. Harcourt lied to a patient. "I'm afraid we are temporarily out of supply," he said gently. "I must reassess its effects." Mrs. Leary stared at him, her expression collapsing into confusion and something darker. Her hands trembled as she stood. She said nothing as she left the room. The soft click of the closing door echoed like a verdict. That night, Harcourt sat alone in his darkening office, the heroin bottle still perched upon his desk, shimmering under the last remnants of gaslight. He did not reach for it again, but its presence haunted him. And in that quiet, suffocating darkness, Dr. Harcourt finally understood what Chicago had yet to see. This was not merely a medicine. It was a silent captor, a velvet chain, and in prescribing it, he had bound the city and himself to something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Behind Wexler and Sons Pharmacy, where the gaslit respectability of State Street gave way to narrow brick corridors and drifting chimney soot, a small alley wound between buildings like a forgotten vein. Delivery boys passed through it each morning, wheeling crates of glass bottles and parcels of imported remedies. Cats prowled the shadows. A single lantern mounted to the back wall cast a weak, flickering glow across the cobblestones. It had always been an unremarkable place, until that winter. Edwin Wexler first noticed the change on a late afternoon when the sky hung low with slate-colored clouds. He had stepped outside to discard a crate of broken glass. As he pushed open the back door, he nearly stumbled over a man standing there, thin, pale, shoulders hunched against the cold. The man started, then straightened, offering a weak smile. His eyes were strangely bright, pupils narrowed. "Evening, lad," he murmured. "Didn't mean to frighten you." Edwin recognized him as Mr. Claiborne, a bookbinder who frequented the shop for tonics. But Claiborne's appearance was markedly different, his complexion sallow, his hands trembling slightly despite the frigid air. "Everything all right, sir?" Edwin asked cautiously. Claiborne nodded too quickly. "Yes, yes, just getting some air." But when Edwin returned inside, he saw Claiborne slip quietly into the pharmacy moments later through the front door, requesting another bottle of heroin before the day was even over. It happened again the next evening, and the one after that. Soon, it was not just Claiborne. A laundress from Wabash Avenue stood in the alley one morning, wringing her hands, waiting for the shop to open. A young streetcar conductor lingered behind the building at dusk, pacing nervously before mustering the courage to enter the pharmacy. A seamstress, a woman who had always seemed composed, skulked there with reddened eyes, biting her lip until it bled. The alley, once empty, had become a gathering point for the quietly desperate. Edwin noticed patterns, the restless pacing, the twitching fingers, the hollowed cheeks. They came early, before business hours. They lingered late, long after closing. Some pretended to be passing through, others hid in the shadows, pretending to examine posters pasted to the walls. But their eyes always drifted toward the back door, toward the place where, they hoped, the golden bottle would emerge. One snowy evening, after locking up, Edwin stepped into the alley and found two men arguing in hushed tones. Their words were sharp, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "You said you had more," one hissed. "I told you I don't," the other snapped. "I came to get more myself." Both fell silent when they saw Edwin. He swallowed hard. "The shop is closed," he said gently. "You'll need to return in the morning." The men exchanged glances, frustration, and something dangerously close to panic. They nodded stiffly and disappeared into the shadows, moving with a frantic energy that set Edwin's heart pounding. By the next week, the alley felt alive, with a strange current. Customers who had once walked proudly through the front doors now slipped in through the back whenever they thought no one was looking. Some knocked softly on the rear entrance, voices quivering as they called Edwin's name. Others waited in silence, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the handle as though willing it to turn. One night, Edwin found a small pouch on the doorstep. Inside lay 2 silver coins and a folded note. "Please, just 1 bottle. I beg you." His stomach twisted. He pocketed the note and said nothing. Inside the pharmacy, his father noticed the uptick in empty bottles returned, their glass scraped clean, as though the syrup had been consumed to its last possible drop. He noticed the way customers leaned too close to the counter, hands trembling. He noticed, too, that some no longer met his eyes, ashamed, desperate, unraveling. But the elder Wexler refused to admit what Edwin already knew. The alley had become a silent confessional, a place where ordinary people, teachers, clerks, seamstresses, widowers, revealed the truth of their dependency in the only way they knew how: by waiting, lingering, pacing, begging. The golden-labeled bottle had transformed them, not into criminals, no, not yet, but into something quieter, something more haunting, souls bound not by vice or wickedness, but by need, a need they could neither articulate nor bear. Each night, as Edwin bolted the back door, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. For he understood, with growing dread, that the alley behind the pharmacy had become Chicago's first shadowed doorway into addiction, and the city, unknowingly, had begun to gather in its depths. In the corner of a well-appointed parlor on Dearborn Street, beneath a painting of the family estate in soft pastels, stood the grandmother's cabinet. It was a sturdy piece, dark oak polished to a mirror sheen, with glass doors that glimmered like still water beneath the afternoon light. Behind those doors rested jars of preserved fruits, delicate bone china, silver spoons, and an assortment of remedies handed down over generations. It was a place of care, of ritual, of whispered knowledge. And now it held something new. The amber bottle with the golden label that had begun to infiltrate the lives of Chicago's most respectable households. Grandmother Eleanor Worthington had been a matron of unquestioned authority for decades. Her hands were lined with the history of tending children, households, and a modest fortune, her eyes sharp with the knowledge of human frailty. When Dr. Harcourt recommended the new tonic Heroin, they called it a marvel of European chemistry. She accepted it with the cautious optimism of one accustomed to following physicians' advice, yet never blindly. At first, the remedy was tucked neatly behind the chamomile jars, its presence acknowledged but understated. A teaspoon for herself, a teaspoon for her granddaughter when a restless cough persisted, a measured drop for the household maid whose nerves were frayed from endless winter labors. The effect was immediate. Calm descended like a soft veil, voices softened, hands trembled less, sleep arrived more easily. Eleanor admired the miracle, the quietness it brought to her parlor, the steady composure it imposed on a household accustomed to occasional chaos. But the bottle held more than calm, it carried dependency disguised as comfort. Soon, Eleanor noticed that a single teaspoon no longer sufficed. The maid, initially grateful, began returning earlier, her steps hesitating outside the cabinet before requesting a second or third dose. The granddaughter, whose small cough had seemed innocent, now lingered by the cabinet each evening, eyes bright and hands hovering over the amber glass. Eleanor observed these changes with mounting unease. She watched her granddaughter's cheeks lose their natural flush, her tiny fingers tremble slightly as she took the remedy. She noticed the maid's eyes, once keen and attentive, grow glazed, her movements slow, almost ceremonial. As she retrieved the tonic, even Eleanor herself felt it, a strange warmth spreading through her limbs after taking her measure, followed by a soft drowsiness that lingered into morning, leaving her heavier, less certain, more suspended. The cabinet, once a symbol of care and heritage, had become a sentinel of subtle decay. One evening, the household was gathered in the parlor, the winter fire casting long shadows across the polished floor. Eleanor poured a teaspoon of the tonic for her granddaughter, watching as the child's small hand closed around the spoon, lifting it with an ease that seemed unnatural. The girl's eyes fluttered shut as the liquid passed her lips, a faint sigh escaping her like steam from the fireplace. Eleanor felt a prickle of doubt. She recalled the clerk on LaSalle Street, the factory worker who had forgotten to eat, the performers whose talent was tethered to the golden syrup. And now, here, in her own home, the quiet miracle was weaving its invisible threads through the lives of those she loved. She closed the cabinet doors slowly, lingering on the reflective surface. The bottles gleamed faintly, as if aware of the power they held. Their contents were still, almost benign. But Eleanor had begun to understand the truth hidden behind their polished exteriors. The tonic was no longer simply a cure. It was an enchantment. It soothed, it calmed, it healed, but it demanded its tribute in subtle increments, and those who relied upon it did not always return whole. The room smelled of lavender, firewood, and faint almond, the perfume of the tonic, almost imperceptible but insistent. Eleanor's fingers brushed the edge of the cabinet as she pondered the growing shadows across her household. She felt a tightening in her chest, a quiet dread that perhaps her vigilance was too little, too late. Heroin had found its way into the grandmother's cabinet. It was beautiful. It was polished. It was patient. And within the polished glass, it waited, unhurried, for the hearts and minds it would claim next. The offices of the Chicago Tribune were a labyrinth of ink-stained floors, clattering typewriters, and the low murmur of telegraph operators sending news across the city and beyond. Here, the scent of fresh print mingled with the faint tang of gaslight and smouldering coal, creating a haze that clung to the lungs like fog over the river. Among the reporters bustling through the narrow corridors was one man who had begun to notice a peculiar pattern in the stories circulating through the city, one that disturbed him more than the usual crime or fire reports. Elias Monroe, 28, and lean with restless energy, had spent years perfecting the art of observation. He could discern the nuance in a politician's glance, the tremor in a factory foreman's voice, the hidden anxiety beneath the polished veneer of the social elite. But nothing had prepared him for the strange new rhythm that had begun to pulse through Chicago. It was subtle at first. Letters from readers arrived, praising a new tonic, a miracle cure, they said, that eased coughs, soothed nerves, and softened sleepless nights. Advertisements appeared in the margins of the society pages, extolling the virtues of a golden-labeled bottle imported from Europe. And yet, in the course of reporting on unrelated events, a theater opening, a winter market, a factory accident, Monroe began to notice hints of something darker. At the music halls, performers praised the tonic with hushed fervor, their eyes bright but their movements unusually slow. In boarding houses and parlors, servants whispered of restless patrons, of children sleeping too deeply, of mothers who trembled while reaching for the remedy. Factories reported minor accidents that seemed innocuous at first but carried an odd consistency, tied always to the use of the same golden syrup. Monroe's curiosity hardened into apprehension when a letter arrived from a nurse in the women's ward of the city hospital. She described a strange quiet descending over her patients, a hush that seemed unnatural, a compliance almost spectral. "They sleep so soundly it frightens me," she wrote. "And yet, when awake, they beg for more of the tonic, though it is meant only as a cure." He reread the note several times, the words searing themselves into his mind. The nurse had not asked for attention or fame. She simply sought to warn, and in that warning, Monroe discerned a story darker than any he had yet reported. He began to investigate, interviewing pharmacists, doctors, and patients alike. Each account was draped in polite tones and careful discretion. No one would speak plainly. The tonic was gentle, they insisted. It was modern, it was safe, it was indispensable. Yet their faces betrayed subtle unease, the way the hands trembled slightly while reaching for a pen, the way eyes flickered to a bottle tucked in a coat pocket, the way lips pressed tightly to conceal questions they dared not voice. Monroe drafted notes furiously, pages filled with observations, names, dates, and small, nearly imperceptible patterns. He felt the gravity of the story pressing upon him, an invisible weight that made his shoulders ache. It was a story the city would not want to hear. It was a story that could ruin reputations, shatter trust, and expose a fragile society to a reality it was too polite to confront. Yet the story demanded telling. By night, he wandered the streets along State and Dearborn, past pharmacies and parlors, peering into windows and watching shadows move. He saw children drifting through snow-muffled streets, hands clasping small bottles, eyes glassy and too bright. He saw workers leaning heavily on railings outside factories, swaying with exhaustion and dependence. He saw mothers clutching their infants a little too tightly, a strange calm settling over them both. And always, the golden-labeled bottles gleamed faintly in the lamplight, silent witnesses to the quiet domination they held over the city. Monroe returned to his office, quill poised above paper, heart hammering. The story was vast, insidious, and elegant. It carried the gloss of civilization, but the weight of ruin. He began to write, carefully, in the tone of a society that might read it and dismiss it as cautionary rumor, yet unable to deny the creeping dread that wound through every line. Chicago, the city of steel and ambition, of gilded mansions and smoky factories, had welcomed the tonic as a gift. Monroe understood, more than anyone, that what glimmered like a miracle might also cast the longest shadows. And those shadows were just beginning to gather. In a modest home along the snow-crusted streets of Lincoln Park, the Crenshaw household lay cloaked in a stillness that should have been comforting. Frost pressed itself against the panes, curling in delicate white filigree. The hearth flickered low, casting wavering shadows across walls adorned with family portraits and embroidered samplers. But on this particular winter morning, the stillness carried a weight that made the air itself uneasy. The source of it lay in the cradle. Little Samuel Crenshaw, 3 years of age, pale-cheeked, his breath faint and measured, so unnaturally still that his mother's heart seized each time she leaned close to listen. For weeks, Mrs. Crenshaw had been administering the tonic. Prescribed carefully by a visiting physician, it was meant to ease her son's persistent cough and quiet the restlessness that had kept the household awake for endless nights. 1 teaspoon in warm milk, the doctor had instructed, just before bedtime. It worked, of course. The child slept. The cough eased. The nights, once filled with wails and frantic pacing, passed in hushed relief. But now, in the pale light of dawn, Samuel did not wake. Mrs. Crenshaw's fingers shook as she brushed back the thin locks of his hair, her palm cold against his feverless skin. "Samuel, my darling," she whispered, each syllable trembling in the frosted room. The child did not stir. Not a murmur, not a shift of the blanket. The soft rise and fall of his chest persisted only faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though he floated just beyond the reach of life itself. Panic rose in Mrs. Crenshaw like a bitter tide. She called for her husband, who rushed from the next room, his boots scraping against the polished floorboards. Together, they shook the boy gently, their voices raised in pleading and alarm. Still, he did not awaken. Only the faint scent of almond lingered in the air, a sweet trace, unmistakable, of the amber syrup that had been meant to soothe him. In that moment, the Crenshaws understood something their neighbors had not yet dared admit. The tonic, so elegantly praised, so delicately administered, had done more than calm their child's cough. It had quieted him entirely, lulled him into a silence too deep, a stillness that frightened rather than comforted. They carried Samuel to the nursery window, letting the weak winter light fall across his face. Frost formed patterns on the glass, intricate and ephemeral, like the delicate lace of a web. Each line seemed to mirror the fragile lattice of their own anxiety, intertwining with the realization that the remedy they had trusted, the golden-labeled miracle so praised in papers and parlors alike, had begun to claim something essential. By mid-morning, Dr. Harcourt himself arrived, summoned by a frantic neighbor who had been privy to the Crenshaws' desperation. His steps were brisk, measured, yet when he entered the nursery, even his practiced calm faltered. He knelt beside the child, feeling for pulse, listening intently. The warmth of the body persisted, but faintly, like a candle struggling against the wind. "It is the tonic," he admitted quietly to Mrs. Crenshaw, his velvet voice carrying an unusual tremor. "Too much has been given, or perhaps too often. It is a delicate medicine, my dear, but the smallest misstep—" He paused, his hands hovering helplessly above the child. "Even a teaspoon can carry consequences." Mrs. Crenshaw's tears fell silently onto her son's blanket. Her husband gripped her shoulder, both of them shivering not from cold, but from the dawning understanding of the toxin lurking behind the city's golden miracle. In the alleyways, in the parlors, in the soft, hush-filled wards of Chicago, the same quiet grip had begun to take hold. Children slept too deeply. Adults wandered through their days dulled, craving the amber elixir. The city, enamored by elegance and promise, had failed to perceive the danger. Samuel Crenshaw finally stirred late that afternoon, eyes fluttering open with a slow, fragile curiosity. But even as life returned to him, the Crenshaws understood the truth that would haunt them for years. The tonic that soothed, that promised calm, was not merely medicine. It was an enchantment, a golden thread slowly binding the city's children, their families, and the innocent hands that administered it ever tighter into its quiet dominion. And Chicago, oblivious, continued to welcome it with open arms. Dr. Nathaniel Harcourt sat alone in his office, the gaslight casting long, trembling shadows across the polished oak floor. Outside, the city shivered under a late winter chill, but inside, the warmth of the radiator could not chase the weight that pressed upon him. He had watched the tonic heroine, a marvel he once heralded, slip from promise into peril, and he could no longer disguise the tremor in his own hands as he reached for his medical ledger. It was not pride that had guided him when the first bottles arrived from Europe, nor the polished shine of the golden labels that so captivated his patients. He had acted, as every physician claimed to act, in service of relief. A cough soothed, a sleepless night silenced, a trembling heart calmed. He believed, as any rational man might, that science had delivered perfection in measured doses. Yet perfection, he had come to realize, was a veneer thin, fragile, and deadly. The first signs had been subtle. Mrs. Forsyth's hands had trembled ever so slightly when she accepted her prescription. Mr. Talbot had lingered in the doorway, staring as if the tonic had given him a vision he could not articulate. Harcourt, ever confident in the competence of modern chemistry, dismissed these anomalies as winter malaise, city fatigue, the frailty of delicate constitutions. But in the quiet hours, alone with the ledger, he recorded details he could not ignore. Early returns, trembling voices, pallid cheeks, pinprick pupils. Each entry a small indictment of the tonic he had praised so loudly. It was the incident with young Samuel Crenshaw that struck deepest. Harcourt had been summoned to the Crenshaw residence at dawn, a flurry of snow still clinging to the city streets. The boy had lain in his cradle, eyes closed, chest barely rising, while his parents hovered in panic. Harcourt administered the standard assessment, listening to pulse and breath, and found the child's warmth faint, yet persistent. In that instant, Harcourt felt a dread unlike any he had experienced in his career. The realization was immediate and inescapable. The medicine he had trusted, the tonic he had championed, could bind life itself into a fragile, perilous stasis. He returned to his office, the street lamp glow falling through the frosted windows, and sat with the bottle before him. Its amber contents shimmered in the lamplight like captured sunlight. He had touched it countless times, prescribed it with a calm that reassured patients and nurses alike. And now he recognized the subtle, quiet danger it carried, a power that eluded detection until it gripped fully. Harcourt's mind replayed the women's wards, the music halls, the factory floors, the alley behind the pharmacy. Faces flashed before him, pale children, trembling clerks, mothers with glassy eyes, performers with unnaturally serene expressions. All had been soothed, yes, but at what cost? Dependence had spread silently, elegantly, as if guided by some invisible hand. What he had called relief, others would one day call a subtle dominion, a quiet enchantment that entrapped the innocent in velvet chains. The physician's conscience gnawed at him. He had been an instrument of this quiet spreading, and for the first time he understood the breadth of his complicity. The tonic was no longer a medicine alone. It was a force, elegant yet merciless, and his praise had lent it credibility. Every prescription he had written, every dose he had recommended, had carried not merely comfort, but the slow erosion of self-control and agency. Harcourt's velvet voice, once confident and soothing, now sounded hollow in the empty office. He imagined confronting his patients, explaining the danger, revealing the truth. Yet he knew that revelation would be met with disbelief or denial. The city was enchanted, and revelation might shatter the fragile illusions that kept society moving. And so he sat, staring at the bottle, feeling the warmth that came from a substance meant to comfort, and lamenting the hours, the days, the lives he had gently nudged toward dependence. The regret was heavy, persistent, like the soft snow pressing against his office window, and it would not lift. Dr. Harcourt had delivered relief, yes, but he had also delivered something darker, and for that he could offer no remedy. The city streets of Chicago grew quieter after dusk, though not silent. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over uneven cobblestones, and the occasional street lamp flickered with weak, wavering flame, casting long shadows across the frost-slicked sidewalks. In those hours, the grand display windows of Wexler & Sons Pharmacy shone like lanterns against the darkness, the golden-labeled bottles of heroin catching the light in small, mesmerizing glimmers. And within the shop itself, a faint warmth lingered, a mixture of gas lamps, heated brass stoves, and the peculiar, sweet scent of the tonic that had begun to infiltrate the city's routines. On those nights, Edwin Wexler often found himself lingering behind the counter, polishing scales or adjusting rows of glass jars. The pharmacy was ostensibly closed, the official hour had passed, but a quiet stream of visitors continued to arrive. Some knocked softly on the back door, voices tentative, hushed. Others waited in the alley behind the building, casting anxious glances toward the frosted windows, as if hoping the amber liquid would call to them through the glass. They were the city's quiet dependents, clerks, seamstresses, mothers, and factory workers, all drawn to the golden elixir as moths to a flame. Each had reasons, some whispered, others not voiced at all. Insomnia, cough, frayed nerves, weariness of life, they arrived seeking relief. And the pharmacy, still open in spirit if not by law, provided it with the discretion of a confidant. The first of these late visitors was always careful. A clerk with ink-stained fingers would hover near the door, hat in hand, his breath misting faintly in the cold air. When Edwin finally acknowledged him, he would murmur the usual request. "Just a small dose, please. Only enough to steady the night." Edwin would measure it with practiced precision, the syrup catching the lamp's glow like liquid amber. The man would drink it slowly, almost reverently, and leave, his steps lighter but eyes distant, as if part of him had wandered elsewhere. Soon, the pattern multiplied. One night, 2 mothers arrived in succession, children swaddled and asleep beneath thick coats. They whispered thanks, speaking in hushed tones, and accepted their measured doses as though taking a rare treasure. A factory worker lingered in the doorway, coat collar turned up against the wind, asking for an extra half teaspoon, claiming that fatigue had stolen the edge from his hands. And always, Edwin noticed the subtle tremor in the hands receiving the tonic, the faint sheen of sweat on foreheads, the quickened pulse beneath calm exteriors. His father, Mr. Wexler, observed the late-night crowd with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Business was thriving, certainly. The golden-labeled bottles glimmered in the window and in the hands of grateful customers. The pharmacy was alive with purpose, providing relief, earning trust, and most importantly, maintaining a polite discretion that reassured the city. Yet, behind that polished service lurked a quiet dread. The pace of requests was accelerating. Patrons who once waited days for another bottle now appeared nightly, sometimes twice. And in their eyes, Edwin began to see a shadow, a silent entreaty, a growing dependence, a hunger not easily named. The alley beyond the back entrance had become an extension of the pharmacy itself, a waiting room for the restless. Shadows shifted along its brick walls as those seeking relief paced in anxious circles, murmuring to themselves or to one another. The air smelled faintly of snow, coal, and something sweeter almond, floral, medicinal hints of the amber syrup that had begun to dominate their nights. And yet, despite all signs, the city remained untroubled. The pharmacy stayed open late, willingly or otherwise, providing calm for those who demanded it, ignoring the subtle, insidious patterns emerging in the shadows. The golden-labeled bottles gleamed on the counter under gaslight, silent, patient, unyielding. And within that gleam, Edwin could feel the quiet truth. The tonic, so celebrated, so carefully administered, was no longer merely a remedy. It was a tether. It was a chain. It was a quiet, insidious power, wrapping itself around the city's most vulnerable 1 teaspoon at a time. West Madison Street, once a bustling artery of Chicago's industrious North Side, had always worn its vitality proudly. Its cobblestones echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the steady tap of factory workers' boots. Shop fronts gleamed in the weak winter sunlight, their windows displaying bolts of cloth, tins of coffee, and the intricate gleam of polished brass. Yet, as the tonic of the city heroin made its quiet, pervasive passage into households and workplaces alike, the thoroughfare began to shift in character. The liveliness that had once defined it dulled, like color fading from a cherished painting left too long in the sun. It began subtly, imperceptibly to the casual observer. The baker's boy no longer called out the morning's fresh bread with a bright voice. Instead, he wandered along the sidewalk, his eyes distant, fingers flexing absently against his sides. The seamstress who ran the embroidery shop leaned against the doorway for hours, her hands idle despite the intricate patterns of thread laid across her lap. Patrons came and went, but a strange hush followed them, their movements muted, their conversations subdued, as though each word required careful deliberation to prevent some unseen misfortune. Pharmacies along the street were among the first indicators of the subtle decline. Heroin, stored behind polished counters and sold under polite assurance, had become the unseen backbone of West Madison's daily life. Clerks observed customers returning with unnerving regularity. Faces, once alert and expressive, now carried a faint pallor beneath the sheen of civility. The amber syrup glimmered in bottles like captured sunlight, promising comfort and calm, yet exacting a toll invisible to all but the most attentive. In the evenings, the street grew quieter still. Gas lamps flickered along the sidewalks, casting tall, wavering shadows that fell across windows and cobblestones alike. Workers returning from factories walked with uneven steps, their eyes glassy and hands clutching parcels of the tonic tucked in coat pockets. Mothers carrying children stopped beneath lamplights, adjusting swaddling blankets, their expressions softened, distant, as though the warmth of the syrup had drawn them into a half-world of suspended awareness. Even the familiar shouts of the night watch, once crisp and commanding, seemed dulled, muffled by the pervasive calm that spread from doorway to doorway. The buildings themselves seemed to lean into the street differently, shadowed corners deepening, brickwork absorbing the diminished energy of its inhabitants. Windows no longer reflected bustling interiors but faint flickers of lamplight across empty rooms. The laughter and chatter that had once echoed through corridors now existed only as faint recollections in the minds of shopkeepers and residents alike. Mr. Edwin Wexler walked West Madison Street frequently during his evening rounds, noting the gradual decay of vitality with unease. He saw shopkeepers linger in doorways longer than necessary, their hands fidgeting, eyes darting toward pockets where the golden bottles might be concealed. Streetcar conductors paused at stops, blinking absently, and young clerks trailed behind their supervisors with an uncharacteristic heaviness in their step. The subtle uniformity of the change struck Edwin more than any dramatic display. It was a quiet acquiescence, a city lulled into a fragile trance by the very remedy meant to comfort it. In the back alleys, whispers carried among shadows. Residents shared discreet stories of children sleeping too deeply, workers stumbling slightly under the weight of an unseen burden, mothers gazing into cradles with unnerving calm. The tonic had woven itself into lives with a velvet hand, offering relief while quietly undermining vigilance, softening nerves and reflexes alike. By the time the first hints of spring touched Madison Street, the decline was unmistakable. The street retained its outward sheen, the polished brass, the clean windows, the scent of bread baking, but beneath it all, an invisible malaise had taken root. The rhythm of the city had slowed. Movements were softer, voices quieter, the hum of life dampened. West Madison Street, like the rest of Chicago, had become entangled in the quiet dominion of the golden tonic, and through it all, the bottles gleamed in pharmacy windows, silent, patient, and unyielding. The street had changed. The city had changed. And the true cost of the miracle, elegant and golden though it was, remained hidden, waiting, in the austere halls of Chicago's medical colleges, where polished floors reflected the crisp gaslight and lecture halls smelled faintly of formaldehyde and chalk. A quiet alarm began to circulate. Professors, usually impervious to the ordinary disturbances of the city, whispered urgently among themselves. It was winter still, and the tonic heroin, the golden elixir that had taken root in homes, parlors, and pharmacies alike, had begun to manifest its subtle dominion upon patients, students, and even colleagues. Its effects were not the overt calamities that made headlines, but the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of attention, discipline, and alertness. Dr. Malcolm Forsyth, a senior lecturer in materia medica, convened a meeting with his colleagues one grey morning. The snow pressed against the windows in filigree patterns, the streets muffled in frost and silence. Inside, the professors huddled around a polished oak table, their expressions taut, fingers drumming upon brass-bound ledgers. "We are observing troubling patterns," Forsyth began, his voice low, deliberate, trembling only slightly. Students report patients returning in unusual states, overly tranquil, unresponsive beyond what the prescriptions should induce. Cases of overdose are not rampant, yet the subtle dependence is undeniable. Even those we trust, those we instruct to administer with care, are faltering. The murmurs that rippled through the room were tinged with disbelief and unease. Dr. Harriet Willoughby, who had taught obstetrics for nearly 2 decades, spoke with measured dread. "I have observed young mothers in wards, previously strong and attentive, now passive to a degree that frightens even the nurses. The syrup soothes, yes, but it lulls them into a stupor I cannot explain. I fear our assurances to parents may now be our liability." Across the table, Dr. Edwin Keene, a chemist by training, adjusted his spectacles, hands clutching a journal filled with patient reports. "And it spreads so elegantly," he murmured. "Unlike opium, which was crude, recognizable, feared, this is acceptable. It is praised. It enters homes, parlors, factories, and wards under the guise of science and civility. How do we even begin to quantify its subtle grip?" Forsyth leaned forward, fingers pressed together. "We must reconsider dosage. We must retrain our students in caution, in vigilance. There is no room for complacency when a remedy can, so easily, lull the city into dependence." But among the younger lecturers, unease mingled with disbelief. One muttered, almost bitterly, "Dependence? We are prescribing a marvel, a product of European precision. We are the arbiters of its use, yet you speak of addiction as if it were inevitable?" Forsyth's eyes, sharp as a scalpel, met theirs. "It is not inevitable, yet it is present. The reports are clear. Clerks, mothers, performers, children, they are slipping into it quietly. The public praises it, and we, in our pride, risk being blind to its influence until it is too late." Discussions continued through the grey afternoon, debates punctuated by faint gasps, the distant rumble of streetcars outside, the soft hiss of radiators, and the murmurs of students moving between lecture halls. Observations were shared, theories posited, warnings repeated. Every professor present recognized the delicate horror. The tonic was not merely a medicine, it was a quiet conqueror. By evening, a resolution emerged, not fully formed, not yet shared with the city, but crystallizing in the minds of those who understood its gravity. The colleges would issue stricter instructions for administration. Prescriptions would be scrutinized more closely. Students would be trained to observe not only the effects, but the subtle shadows cast by the remedy. Yet even as Forsyth left the college that night, the gas lamps casting long, wavering shadows on snow-slicked streets, he understood the truth that no resolution could alter. Chicago was already enmeshed in the tonic's grasp. Its glow was everywhere, in parlors, nurseries, pharmacies, and wards. Its touch was gentle, elegant, and pervasive. And the city, enamored by refinement and progress, remained blissfully unaware of the quiet panic growing in the very halls of its medical guardians. Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth, widow of a merchant whose fortunes had been secured in the halcyon days before the frost of debt and industry pressed upon the city, sat in the dim light of her parlor with hands folded delicately in her lap. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, polish, and lavender, mingling with the soft smoke curling from a coal grate. Outside, snow had begun its quiet descent once more, muffling the clatter of carriages and the distant whistle of streetcars. But inside, another winter had settled, a more insidious cold, traced in the lines of her face, in the tremor of her voice, and in the story she had begun to tell. It was a story of subtle erosion, of elegance entwined with danger. Her son, young Edward, had been restless as a child, prone to coughs that lingered through winter nights and mornings alike. Doctors had prescribed tonics and syrups with care, but none had worked as effectively, or so they claimed, as the golden-labeled tincture now whispered about in parlors, printed in newspapers, and recommended with the soft authority of physicians whose confidence had not yet faltered. Mrs. Forsyth had been cautious, measured, 1 teaspoon before bed, and another for the child only when sleep would not come. She prided herself on diligence, on following instructions to the letter. Yet, even under her watchful eye, Edward's dependence grew. He no longer slept merely in response to fatigue or comfort. He slept because the tonic had softened his nerves to a velvet hum, muted the edges of fear and pain alike. The city's acclaimed miracle had become a necessity. Her confession began softly, almost shyly, as she recounted the first nights when she had noticed the change. Edward had slept too deeply. Hands that should have flexed with youthful vigor lay slack against his bedding. Cheeks that had once flushed with life were pale beneath the winter lamplight. Each awakening brought a slight pause, a moment when his eyes failed to focus, when his small fingers trembled ever so subtly as they reached for the empty cup beside him. "Madam," a nurse had whispered once, visiting the household as part of a routine check. "He sleeps as if caught in a dream that cannot end." Adelaide remembered the weight of those words pressing against her chest. She had brushed them aside, rationalized them. The child was well. The cough was gone. The tonic was gentle. Yet, as weeks passed, the unease compounded. Edward began to wake, with a faint shimmer in his eyes, a certain longing she could not name. He would ask, softly, for just a little more, as if the liquid contained something essential to his very being. And then came the accident that haunted her still. One evening, after taking the tonic, Edward had wandered from his bed to the hearth, dazed, tripping over a rug. His small hands grazed the hot coals, leaving a red line across his wrist. The nurse arrived in time to soothe him, yet the incident lingered in Adelaide's mind, a quiet, harrowing reminder that the golden remedy, so praised and trusted, carried dangers that no one could fully anticipate. She thought of the other families she had observed in society, children who slept too deeply, mothers whose voices were softened to tremulous whispers, men and women whose composure had become unsteady beneath the tonic's subtle sway. The stories gathered like frost on window panes, glimmering in the half-light of reality and denial. Adelaide pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the beat of her own anxious heart. The tonic had promised calm. It had delivered serenity. Yet beneath that calm lurked a quiet dominion, one that claimed agency as casually as it bestowed sleep. Her voice, soft and deliberate, carried the tremor of grief and understanding alike. "It is a blessing and a curse," she murmured. "It calms, but it binds. It soothes, but it takes. And in our desire for relief, we hand over more than we realize." The coal grate hissed softly. Snow drifted past frost-patterned panes, and the parlor seemed to hold its breath. Outside, Chicago carried on, blissfully ignorant of the golden-labeled bottles shaping the lives within its homes. Within her own walls, Adelaide Forsyth knew a truth the city had yet to face. The miracle that promised peace had begun to exact its price, one soft, subtle heartbeat at a time. On a grey and brittle morning, the street lamps along State and Dearborn struggled against a wind that cut through the winter haze like a sharpened blade. Snow pressed itself into corners, powdered windowsills, and settled on the cobblestones, muffling the city's usual clatter. In the heart of the street, Wexler and Sons Pharmacy stood resolute, a bastion of polished brass, gleaming glass, and amber-toned remedies that had begun to define the city's quiet dependence. It was here, beneath the stoic golden bottles, that lawmen came calling. Constable Whitlock arrived first, his greatcoat buttoned high, his boots scuffing against the icy stones. Behind him, Sergeant Dunham followed, notebook in hand, eyes sharp and calculating. The two men had been observing a subtle pattern that had begun to unsettle their evening rounds. Citizens lingering outside the pharmacy, long after closing, whispering, casting furtive glances at the back entrance. A curiosity turned concern, and concern had, at last, ripened into a visit. Inside, Edwin Wexler polished the counter, adjusting rows of glass jars so that they gleamed under the weak gaslight. His father, Mr. Wexler, hovered near the ledger, a practiced smile in place but eyes wary, aware that this visit carried implications far beyond polite inspection. The lawmen entered with quiet authority, boots clicking softly, breath misting in the warm air. "Good morning, gentlemen," Mr. Wexler said, inclining his head with careful courtesy. "How may we assist you?" Whitlock's eyes swept the shelves, pausing briefly on the golden-labeled bottles of heroin. "We've received reports," he said slowly, voice measured, "of unusual activity here, citizens gathering in the alley behind the pharmacy after hours. Some requesting substances before the official closing. We've come to ensure nothing improper is occurring." Edwin's stomach tightened. He forced a calm expression. "Of course, officers. Everything here is above board. We operate within the law, sir." Dunham stepped forward, notebook open. "These bottles, heroin, is it? Imported from Europe?" His pen hovered expectantly. "We've heard whispers of a tonic that spreads quietly among the population, that is, consumed with growing frequency." Mr. Wexler nodded, his hand lightly resting on a bottle. "Yes, a tonic, recommended by physicians, sold with proper instruction. Nothing illicit occurs here." Whitlock studied him, brow furrowed. "Proper instruction or no, we've observed citizens, children, clerks, and mothers returning repeatedly for the tonic, sometimes more than once in a day. There are reports of fainting, prolonged sleep, trembling, indications of dependency, perhaps." Edwin felt his face pale beneath the warm glow of the gaslight. He had noticed these same signs, the trembling hands, the anxious eyes, the soft murmurs in the alley. Yet to hear them voiced aloud by the lawmen struck with the weight of undeniable scrutiny. "We keep careful records," Edwin said quietly, gesturing toward the ledger. "Every bottle measured, every prescription noted. We cannot control the desires of those who come seeking relief." Whitlock's gaze softened, though unease lingered. "It is not the intent we question, young man, but the effect is clear. Even with proper oversight, this tonic is altering the lives of citizens. We cannot ignore the consequences." Dunham flipped through his notebook, noting each observation. "We are not here to close your establishment," he said. "We are here to remind you of your responsibility. The tonic, though praised and seemingly benign, carries dangers that must be acknowledged. We advise caution. Observe your patrons. Report any alarming cases." The visit concluded with polite bows and murmured assurances. The lawman departed, boots clicking against cobblestones, leaving a faint chill that seeped through the warm pharmacy air. Edwin and his father exchanged glances, the unspoken weight pressing heavily upon them. The amber bottles gleamed innocently, catching the first pale light of morning, but their calm surface belied the gravity of the warning delivered in hushed, official tones. Outside, the alley remained quiet, yet shadows lingered in its corners. Citizens would return, as they always did, drawn irresistibly to the promise of relief. The golden-labeled bottles would continue to shine. The city, oblivious to the quiet dominion settling among its people, carried on. And within the pharmacy, Edwin and his father felt the first real tremor of fear, an understanding that even legality and decorum could not shield them from the creeping grasp of the tonic they had once celebrated. West Madison Street, a thoroughfare once vibrant with commerce and the steady rhythm of Chicago's industrious life, had begun to assume a peculiar stillness. The winter snow clung in thin, icy layers across cobblestones, and the gas lamps along the sidewalks flickered with an uncertain light, casting long, wavering shadows upon windows and doorways. It was here, amid the orderly shops and bustling factories, that the subtle, insidious influence of the golden-labeled tonic heroin made itself known. altering the very character of the street and its denizens. At first, the changes were minor, barely perceptible to anyone not paying close attention. The bakery at the corner, once a chorus of cheerful shouts and the clatter of trays, had grown quiet. The baker's boy, usually energetic and precise, moved with an odd lethargy, his hands trembling as he carried trays of bread into the shop. The seamstress in the neighboring store lingered in her doorway, hands folded in her lap, watching the street without really seeing it. The merchant spoke softly, voices constrained by a calm that seemed unnatural, as though the tonic's influence had stretched invisibly from household to household, seeping into the air. Inside the stores, the shelves gleamed, polished and orderly. The golden-labeled bottles of the tonic glimmered in the lamplight, offering relief, calm, and sleep with a gentle, unyielding promise. Customers arrived quietly, faces pale, hands fumbling as they accepted measured doses. A clerk from the stockyards leaned against a door frame, murmuring softly to himself, awaiting his turn at the counter. Mothers with children clutched them a little too tightly, their eyes distant, the soft murmur of the tonic's effect lingering in their voice. Even children, previously rambunctious and bright, moved in slow, deliberate steps, their eyes glassy and unseeing. The alleyways along the street, once mere thoroughfares for deliveries, had become silent waiting rooms. Patrons loitered there, hands tucked deep into pockets, eyes flicking toward the pharmacy, the familiar amber bottles calling them like distant lanterns in a fog. Whispered exchanges occurred in these shadows, questions about dosage, suggestions of discreet repetitions, murmured gratitude for a relief that dulled more than just coughs or sleeplessness. It was in these hushed corners that the true power of the tonic manifested, a quiet, invisible dependence that no ledger or legal ordinance could record. At Wexler & Sons, Edwin and his father observed the patterns with increasing unease. Bottles returned half empty, prescriptions requested before the day's end. Customers lingered, trembled, whispered. Edwin noted the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of addiction. Hands trembling despite warmth, pupils reduced to pinpoints, faint flushes of unease, masked beneath polite smiles. His father, ever precise, catalogued each occurrence, yet even he could not ignore the growing shadows stretching across West Madison Street. Factories echoed the change. Workers moved with a lethargic grace, as if guided by an unseen hand. Machines, once demanding constant attention, were approached with a careless ease that unnerved foremen. Injuries were slight but frequent, accidents brushed aside with murmurs of fatigue and cold. Yet each event carried the same pattern. The golden tonic nearby, hands trembling, eyes glassy. By nightfall, West Madison Street resembled a theater of subdued motion. Streetcars hissed along tracks, but passengers spoke little. Voices hushed, as though afraid of disturbing the invisible web that had settled over the thoroughfare. Shopkeepers lit lanterns, their glow reflecting in the windows, highlighting the bottles that gleamed behind counters. And outside, in the alleys, shadows waited, silent and patient, for the coming of the next visitor drawn to the amber elixir. The street, like the city itself, had changed imperceptibly but irrevocably. Its energy, once bright and restless, had been softened into a quiet obedience. Life moved still, but not as it had. A golden-labeled tonic had wrapped its velvet chains around the citizens, weaving dependency and calm into the very rhythm of Chicago. And West Madison Street, polished and orderly though it remained, bore witness to a subtle decay, a slow seduction that no one yet dared to name. Beneath the polished streets of Chicago, hidden from gaslit windows and the polite gazes of passing pedestrians, another world had begun to stir, a network of shadows and whispers, where the golden-labeled tonic, Heroin, exchanged hands with a speed and discretion that no official could fully account for. What began as a remedy for coughs and sleeplessness, celebrated in parlors and pharmacies, had become a commodity in the hands of those who understood its quiet power, and the city had yet to notice. The underground trade emerged slowly, imperceptibly, like a frost creeping along a window pane. A clerk, restless and aware of the rapid depletion of the public supply, approached a chemist after hours, offering coins pressed tight in a trembling hand. Mothers, eager for another dose to soothe their children, lingered in alleys, eyes flicking nervously toward lanterns and doorways. Factory hands, anxious for relief from pain and exhaustion, navigated back corridors to meet the discreetly waiting purveyor, the amber liquid glimmering in tiny bottles against the dim glow of gaslight. It was, in its elegance, almost ceremonious. Transactions were conducted in whispers, smiles barely perceptible, a polite exchange of silver or folded notes for measured doses of relief. The patrons spoke little of dependence or fear. Such notions were beneath the polished veneer of civility. They called it necessity, refinement, modernity, the discreet indulgence that allowed one to function, to appear composed, to meet the expectations of a city enamored with order and propriety. In a narrow alley between Dearborn and State, young Edwin Wexler observed the first signs of this nocturnal economy. Through the frosted window of a rear door, he glimpsed men and women slipping past the street lamps, their faces pale beneath scarves and veils. He recognized some: the clerk from Monroe Street, the laundress from Wabash Avenue, the seamstress whose hands he had watched tremble with the strain of repeated doses. They paused for a moment, exchanging coins for bottles in the shadows, and disappeared as silently as they had arrived. It was a trade conducted with the precision of a surgeon's hand, each bottle measured, each dose prescribed with careful discretion. No one questioned the necessity. Few spoke of morality. The transactions were swift, deliberate, polite, a choreography honed by necessity and secrecy. And yet, for all its order, a subtle corruption had begun to take root. The very ease with which the tonic was obtained outside the bounds of law or prescription hinted at the fragility of the social trust the city had long assumed unassailable. Lawmen, constables, and watchmen patrolled the streets, noting shadows that lingered too long, glances exchanged too furtively. But they could not comprehend the extent of the network forming beneath their lamps, nor the quiet desperation that fueled it. Those engaged in the trade were careful, almost reverent, aware of the eyes that might watch, the steps that must not be traced, the voices that must never rise above a whisper. Inside homes, parlors, and nurseries, the effects of this underground economy were reflected in subtle, chilling ways. Children slept too deeply. Mothers whispered to themselves as they administered measured doses. Clerks and artisans moved through their days with a strange serenity, but beneath it, a soft tremor betrayed their reliance. The city, outwardly unchanged, carried the secret pulse of dependency in every home touched by the golden-labeled tonic. By night, the alleyways themselves seemed to pulse with an unspoken rhythm, shadows moving like delicate specters, lit only by the faint glimmer of lanterns and the occasional reflection of amber bottles. The underground trade, quiet yet inexorable, had begun to bind the city together in a chain of necessity, discretion, and unacknowledged fear. And Chicago, so proud of its civility and progress, walked unknowingly upon the first fragile steps of an unseen dominion. The tonic, celebrated and golden, had already begun to rule in silence. On a damp and windswept evening, the city council convened in the grand chamber of Chicago's municipal building, a room steeped in polished wood, gaslight, and the faint odor of ink and parchment. The chamber had seen debates on taxation, infrastructure, and the management of the harbor. Yet on this particular night, the discussion that filled its benches and podiums carried a weight more insidious than the ordinary affairs of governance. The golden-labeled tonic Heroin, praised in parlor and pharmacy alike, had begun to show signs of altering the city itself. and the councilman, for the first time, faced a crisis not entirely visible in ledgers or reports. A hush settled over the chamber as the aldermen gathered. Their faces, usually polished with civility and the practiced patience of men accustomed to debate, carried a faint strain. Gas lamps flickered, catching on gold-braided uniforms, polished shoes, and the occasional glint of spectacles. Whispers rippled through the room like distant wind, as councillors and clerks prepared to confront a phenomenon that was equal parts scientific, social, and moral. Alderman Whitmore, a man of precise diction and sombre bearing, rose first. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the high chamber, "we convene tonight under unusual circumstances. Reports have reached this council of a tonic, widely distributed, celebrated as a remedy for coughs, sleeplessness, and nervous agitation. It is praised by physicians and sought eagerly by the citizens. And yet, these same reports suggest effects beyond the prescribed measure: dependence, unusual somnolence, and—" He faltered, catching the eye of his neighbour, Alderman Cranston, who raised a hand as though to halt the unfolding narrative. "Dependence?" Cranston interjected, his voice careful yet firm. "Are we to discuss rumours or evidence, Whitmore? This council governs by fact, not whisper." Whitmore's fingers pressed into the edge of the podium, steadying his voice. "I present evidence, sir. Letters from physicians, nurses, and citizens. Accounts of individuals, once alert and active, now softened, dulled, dependent. Children sleeping too deeply, workers faltering at their tasks, mothers and matrons requesting repeated doses with a tremulous urgency. The tonic is everywhere, and our city may be succumbing, quietly, to its influence." A murmur ran through the chamber, an uneasy stir of recognition and disbelief. Some councillors shifted in their chairs, uneasy at the prospect of acknowledging a subtle epidemic. Others, accustomed to the discipline of measured debate, frowned at Whitmore's dramatic tone, unwilling to admit the full gravity. Alderman Cranston rose, voice now sharper. "And what, pray, would you have us do? Close the pharmacies? Denounce the physicians? This is a medicine, recommended by our city's learned men. Shall we act on whispers? Or shall we continue to trust in the judgment of science?" Whitmore's gaze hardened, though a shadow of fatigue crossed his face. "Sir, science has been blind to its own elegance. The tonic heroin has spread quietly, refined and golden-labeled, yet leaving a wake of dependency in its stead. We are the city's guardians. If our laws, our oversight, cannot prevent harm, then what authority remains?" The debate fractured further. Some councillors insisted on immediate restrictions, stricter record-keeping, and oversight of prescriptions. Others feared public panic, worried that any mention of danger would ignite unrest among citizens who had come to depend on the tonic for comfort and relief. Voices rose, arguments intertwined, and the chamber itself seemed to pulse with the tension of a city caught between pride, trust, and the first whispers of dread. Meanwhile, outside, the wind howled along State Street, scattering snow like silver dust across the polished streets. Citizens carried on, unaware that the men and women within the council chamber were considering measures born of necessity, confronting the quiet dominion of an amber liquid that gleamed innocently in pharmacy windows. By the end of the evening, no resolution had been reached. Recommendations were drafted, discussions postponed, and a sense of fractured urgency lingered like smoke in the chamber. The golden-labeled bottles continued to shine in windows, quiet and patient, reflecting gaslight and shadow alike. Chicago had glimpsed the first fractures of its own complacency, and the tonic, so celebrated, so beautifully refined, watched from its amber perch, unhurried, unyielding, and quietly triumphant. Dr. Frederick Langley, a physician of impeccable repute and no small pride, had long walked the halls of Chicago's hospitals with measured authority. His voice carried, rich and resonant, commanding attention without arrogance. Patients, nurses, and colleagues alike found solace in his certainty, trusting that his judgment was infallible. Yet that winter, as the golden-labeled tonic Heroin spread quietly through households, factories, and wards, Langley found his authority tested in ways he had never anticipated. It began with a lecture at the College of Physicians, delivered in the Grand Hall, gaslight glimmering off polished floors and leather-bound tomes. He spoke of remedies, of tonic and elixir, of the marvels of modern chemistry and the elegance of science distilled into measured doses. Yet, as he recounted recent cases, patients returning too frequently, children sleeping unnaturally deep, factory workers faltering under mild exertion, his voice rose, urgent, passionate. He named the tonic, describing its amber glow, its sweet almond scent, the golden-labeled bottles that had become so ubiquitous. He warned of dependence, of subtle erosion, of consequences that civilized eyes had failed to perceive. The students, accustomed to restraint and decorum, sat uneasy. Murmurs ran through the hall, some skeptical, some shocked. Colleagues exchanged glances. To speak so plainly of the tonic's dangers was almost revolutionary, even dangerous, in a city that had celebrated it as a miracle. Langley's words carried beyond the lecture hall. A visiting journalist recorded portions of his speech, careful to capture the precise tone, and a small pamphlet circulated among medical circles, warning practitioners of subtle signs of dependency. Pharmacists, initially dismissive, began to observe patterns with a new vigilance. Patients, previously unquestioning, noticed the change in tone, the faint tremor of warning underlying the doctor's calm authority. Yet not all received his caution with gratitude. One evening, Langley was summoned to the parlor of a prominent family on Prairie Avenue. Their child, pale-cheeked and restless, had been administered the tonic with the utmost care. The mother, a widow of considerable means, had followed every instruction meticulously. Yet when Langley arrived and questioned the child's dependence, the mother bristled, her gloved hands trembling as she protested the doctor's insinuation. "You speak as though this elixir harms," she said sharply, "yet it calms my son as nothing else can." Langley's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Madam, I speak not of malice but of truth. The tonic soothes, yes, but it also binds. It is not merely medicine. It is a quiet force, taking more than it returns. One must observe, one must measure, one must heed the warning signs before the subtle erosion becomes irreversible." By morning, whispers had reached the city's medical committees. "Langley speaks too loudly," one noted, a faint tinge of indignation in his voice. "He undermines confidence in our remedies, in the discretion of our physicians, in the very authority of science itself." Others murmured their agreement, concerned that public panic might rise if the tonic's dangers became common knowledge. Yet for all the unease he caused, Dr. Langley continued. He visited homes, factories, and hospitals, noting patterns in hushed tones with nurses and colleagues he trusted. He recorded each instance of subtle dependency: the clerk who requested doses in advance, the seamstress who lingered near the pharmacy after hours, the mother whose child slept too deeply. His ledger, meticulously kept, grew heavier with each observation, a testament to a quiet epidemic unfolding beneath Chicago's polished streets. Outside, the city remained unaware. Shop windows gleamed with amber bottles, parlor fires flickered in cozy warmth, and the golden-labeled tonic awaited the next hand to grasp it, patient, unassuming, and quietly triumphant. Langley, however, had spoken. Too loudly, perhaps, but the words were true, and in truth, there is no silence strong enough to conceal the unfolding dominion of the golden elixir. Along the snow-laden docks of the Chicago River, warehouses stood like silent sentinels against the harsh winter wind, their brick facades dark and foreboding beneath gaslit lamps. Freight doors creaked on rusted hinges, and the scent of coal and river water clung to every corner. It was here, amid the shadows and the faint tang of iron, that the city's hidden dealings with the golden-labeled tonic heroin had begun to converge in ways even the most observant citizens had not yet perceived. The call to raid had come quietly but with urgency. Reports had surfaced of shipments arriving unaccounted for, of crates disappearing before official inspection, and of a growing network distributing the amber elixir beyond the regulated confines of pharmacies. Constables and lawmen, armed with warrants and the weight of civic authority, approached the riverfront warehouse one bitter evening, snow curling around their boots like restless spirits. Inside, the space was cavernous, filled with rows of stacked crates, each marked with discreet labels, some bearing the familiar golden sheen that had begun to dominate city parlors and nurseries alike. The air smelled faintly sweet almond, medicinal, almost perfumed, but it carried a weight, a suggestion of urgency and secrecy that made the men wary. Officers moved with careful precision, lanterns in hand, shadows dancing across walls as they examined each crate. It was Edwin Wexler, summoned by a local magistrate, who guided them through the warehouse. His hands were steady, but his chest tightened with unease as he noted the volume of the tonic awaiting distribution. Each crate contained dozens of glass bottles, amber liquid glinting as though aware of the scrutiny. Some crates were bound for pharmacies, others labeled ambiguously, destined for unknown corners of the city. The sheer abundance was staggering, a silent testament to the tonic's growing dominion over Chicago. "Remarkable," muttered Sergeant Dunham, voice low, observing the meticulous packing. "It's distributed like any other legitimate commodity, yet the purpose, the effects, are far from ordinary." Langley, summoned to witness the proceedings, examined the bottles with careful fingers. He noted subtle variations in labeling, slight discrepancies in dosage instructions, and the rapid turnover that hinted at human reliance beyond prescribed limits. "It is elegant in its execution," he murmured, "and thus all the more dangerous." As the raid progressed, officers discovered crates hidden behind false walls and beneath loose floorboards, suggesting that the tonic's influence had already extended into clandestine networks. Whispers from dockhands and lower-level distributors painted a picture of a city slowly enmeshed in dependence. Mothers requesting extra vials for children, clerks collecting their own supply under the guise of prescription, factory workers trading portions of the tonic like currency. The operation had become sophisticated, almost invisible, a city-wide ballet conducted in shadows. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling footsteps and carriage wheels. Lanterns reflected off icy streets, illuminating the faces of the lawmen as they carried crates to waiting wagons. The amber liquid glimmered, still patient, untouched, silently asserting its quiet dominion. By nightfall, the warehouse stood emptied of the illicit stock, though much had already passed through hands unseen. The officers departed, weary and uncertain, aware that what they had seized represented only a fraction of the network's reach. The riverfront lay silent, dark and cold, a city unaware of the subtle corruption that had threaded itself through its very veins. Within the amber glow of their seized cargo, the truth shimmered plainly. The tonic had spread beyond controlled doses, beyond polite consumption, and now thrived in clandestine corridors, quietly binding the city with invisible chains of dependence. Chicago would awaken to its reality only slowly, but the riverfront raid had confirmed what many had feared in whispers. The golden-labeled tonic was no longer merely a medicine. It was a force, patient, elegant, and merciless in its quiet triumph. The waiting rooms of Chicago's hospitals were chambers of quiet anxiety. Gas lamps cast pools of muted light upon polished floors, and the faint smell of carbolic acid mingled with lingering traces of coal smoke from the city streets. Mothers sat in straight-backed chairs, shawls draped over their shoulders, hands folded across laps, eyes cast downward or fixed nervously upon the brass doorknobs through which nurses and physicians passed. In these rooms, the air carried the soft tension of hope and dread, as the mothers waited not only for diagnoses, but for reassurance, sometimes even a promise of relief distilled in amber syrup. It was here, amid the quiet murmur of restrained conversation, that the full influence of the golden-labeled tonic became visible. Mothers, pale-cheeked and attentive, clutched their children, observing the faint tremors in tiny hands and the subdued coughs that had led them to seek the remedy in the first place. Yet beneath their composed exteriors, an unmistakable tension rippled, the delicate dependence that the tonic had quietly woven into household routines. One mother, Mrs. Hamilton, sat clutching a small vial pressed against her coat. Her infant, swaddled in thick blankets, rested with unusual serenity in her lap. The child's eyelids fluttered but did not open fully, breaths shallow yet regular. She whispered a prayer, a litany of gratitude and worry, for the tonic had calmed the infant, but it had also introduced a new unease, the dependence that now bound them both to its amber liquid. Across the room, Mrs. Callahan, whose son had been a constant patient during the winter months, murmured to the nurse beside her. "He sleeps so deeply after the tonic," she said softly, "and yet when it wears off, I feel as though I no longer recognize him. His hands tremble, his eyes, they are distant." The nurse, experienced and steady, offered a gentle nod, understanding the paradox. "It soothes, madam, but it is not without consequence. Observe him carefully, dose sparingly. Watch for signs of lingering dependence." Other mothers whispered similar observations, each story distinct yet united by a subtle, insidious thread. A woman in the corner spoke of her daughter's unusual calmness, eyes bright yet unfocused. Another recounted how her son's cough had vanished, replaced by a strange heaviness, as though his vitality had been smoothed over by the tonic's gentle but unyielding hand. Even those mothers who had embraced the remedy with gratitude began to note the shifting patterns, the quiet surrender that accompanied each measured teaspoon. In the silence of the waiting room, the amber glow of the tonic seemed almost to radiate from the hands of those who held it. Its presence was comforting and alarming in equal measure, an elegant promise entwined with subtle menace. The mothers, bound by duty, hope, and love, were caught between relief and apprehension, aware yet unwilling to fully name the danger before them. Outside, the city moved on with little awareness of the quiet epidemic taking root in its parlor rooms, nurseries, and waiting areas. Gas lamps flickered along streets, slick with frost, reflecting the soft glow of the tonic in shop windows. Factories hummed their relentless rhythm, oblivious to the dependencies quietly forming among their workers. Even the grand houses along Prairie Avenue, with parlors warm and polished, bore witness to subtle transformations. Children sleeping too deeply, mothers whispering to themselves, the golden-labeled bottles gleaming in silent triumph. Within the waiting room, time stretched. Mothers rocked, whispered, and watched, their attention tethered to both their children and the tonic that had promised relief. The soft hum of the city beyond the walls seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Here, in the quiet tension of anxious anticipation, they sensed a truth that the broader world had yet to acknowledge. The tonic calmed, soothed, and eased, but it also bound the mother, child, and household alike to a quiet dominion that would not easily release its hold. And so, the mothers waited, clutching both hope and amber glass, caught in the delicate balance between comfort and silent surrender. On the outskirts of Chicago, beyond the neat rows of brick homes and gaslit thoroughfares, lay a small cemetery, its gates wrought iron and frost-kissed, a place where the city's shadows gathered in quiet solemnity. Here, among leaning stones and low, snow-dusted mounds, the unmarked graves began to appear small depressions in the frozen earth, some barely large enough to contain the diminutive forms of children, others wide enough to claim adults who had quietly surrendered to the golden-labeled tonic. The dead were neither celebrated nor mourned with ceremony. Their passing was hushed, discreet, acknowledged only in whispers by those who had tended to them in life. Nurses from the women's wards had begun to carry children whose vitality had been eroded by the tincture, faces pale beneath blankets, small hands trembling even in slumber. Factory workers, clerks, and mothers who had relied upon the tonic for calm found themselves buried swiftly, with minimal fanfare, their deaths recorded with a few clinical words and little else. In homes across the city, the quiet absence of these souls was noted only in passing, a subtle space in the household routine that had once been filled by laughter, footsteps, or the soft murmur of breathing in the night. It was Dr. Langley who first became aware of the pattern. Visiting the cemetery on a grey afternoon, he traced his gloved fingers along the rough edges of unmarked mounds, each one telling its own muted story. Infants who had slept too deeply, mothers who had administered the tonic with care, workers who had succumbed to exhaustion and dependence, all were united beneath a thin layer of snow, their names, if recorded at all, left absent from the polished stones that dotted the grounds. Langley felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him. The tonic he had once praised, administered with deliberate care and trusted as modern marvel, had begun to claim lives quietly, invisibly, almost politely, beneath the city's notice. The unmarked graves were not dramatic. No monuments rose in defiance of mortality. No floral arrangements cluttered the frozen earth. Only the cold wind whispered across the low mounds, carrying faint echoes of cries once stilled, laughter once hushed, and the muted sorrow of those who had labored tirelessly in hospitals, pharmacies, and homes alike. Even the crows, usually bold and noisy, seemed subdued, circling above the cemetery in muted patterns, as if aware of the delicate tragedy unfolding below. Families, aware only partially of the tonic's subtle tyranny, mourned quietly within their parlors, whispering to one another of fever or accident, offering prayers without accusation. Society, enamored of refinement and modern science, did not yet suspect the quiet power of the amber liquid, now distributed with a sophistication that concealed its cost. The city continued in its routines, bustling streets filled with conversation and commerce, unseeing of the lives that had been quietly claimed by a remedy once heralded as miraculous. Langley walked among the graves, noting the absence of markers, the uniformity of silence, the weight of invisible grief. Each mound was a testament to dependence disguised as relief, to calm purchased at the expense of vitality, to a city's willingness to trust elegance and reputation over scrutiny and vigilance. He imagined the parents who had held their children close, the clerks who had tucked the vial into their coat pockets, the factory workers who had swallowed the measured spoonful before nightfall. All were gone, their passage noted only by frost, iron gates, and the subtle indentation of the earth itself. In the quiet of the cemetery, the doctor felt the tonic's reach most keenly. Beautiful, golden, innocent in appearance, yet beneath its elegance, it had wrought subtle ruin. And as the wind pressed against the headstones and the snow drifted across the low mounds, Langley understood the depth of the city's vulnerability. The tonic's victims were silent, unseen, unmarked, and the world, enamored of refinement and promise, remained oblivious. Chicago had celebrated relief. Chicago had ignored warning, and the unmarked graves whispered the truth the city had yet to hear. On a pale Sunday morning, when the wind from Lake Michigan carved icicles along the stone facades of Chicago's churches, the congregation gathered beneath arches of oak and stained glass. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingling scents of candle wax, cold stone, and the faint perfume of winter coats pressed close together. The pews creaked softly beneath the weight of faithful bodies, and the murmurs of worshippers whispered against the polished floors like distant echoes. Yet this morning was unlike any other. Reverend Jonathan Pembroke, a man whose sermons were usually measured, comforting, and steeped in gentle moral instruction, rose with a particular gravity that made even the most attentive parishioners still their murmuring hearts. His eyes, dark beneath the furrowed brows of age and concern, swept over the assembly. He saw mothers clutching children whose cheeks were pale beneath knitted caps, young clerks whose eyes held the fatigue of long nights, and matrons whose hands trembled slightly as they turned the pages of hymnals. And in his mind he traced the pattern he had discerned in the city: a quiet dependence, a pervasive calm brought about not by prayer or virtue, but by the golden-labeled tonic that had begun to infiltrate homes, pharmacies, and even hospitals. "My friends," he began, voice low but clear, carrying with it the resonance of authority and care, "we live in a time of marvels. Science offers remedies once unimagined. Medicine, distilled and refined, promises relief from suffering. And yet, I must speak to you today of a subtle peril, a quiet shadow that has entered our households, our streets, our very lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The congregation leaned forward, hushed, aware that the sermon promised more than comforting homilies. Candles flickered across faces pale with curiosity and unease. "The tonic," he continued, "celebrated in our parlor rooms, praised by physicians, admired for its refinement, has begun to claim a dominion over those who seek it. Children sleep too deeply, mothers tremble with anxious dependence, workers falter under its soft, insidious influence. What is intended as comfort has, in many cases, become subtle captivity. And yet, we celebrate it, we welcome it, we offer it to those we love, believing it safe, gentle, and necessary." A murmur passed through the pews. Some mothers pressed fingers to lips, glancing at their children with newly vigilant eyes. A few men stiffened in their collars, recalling a clerk, a neighbor, a relative who seemed softened, dulled, perhaps changed in ways difficult to articulate. The Reverend's words were not dramatic, not sensational. They were precise, measured, and terrifying in their calm clarity. "This is a lesson, my friends," Pembroke continued, "that true vigilance requires not only observation but courage. We must examine the remedies we trust, question the sources of our comfort, and recognize that even in elegance, danger may reside. A bottle may gleam with promise, its label golden and enticing, yet it may exact a toll that our eyes, enamored by surface beauty, fail to perceive." He gestured toward the sunlit altar, where rays illuminated the polished wood and flickering candles. "As we nurture our children, tend to our neighbors, and sustain our households, let us remember that true care demands discernment. Let us look beyond convenience, beyond charm, and beyond the seductive promise of ease, to the enduring truth of human frailty and responsibility." The congregation remained silent for a heartbeat longer than usual, the sermon's cadence lingering in the still air. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter, fathers straightened in their pews, and young clerks felt a weight in their shoulders. Even the older women, accustomed to the routine of gentle admonition, shifted in their seats, eyes wide with the sudden clarity of subtle danger. As the Reverend concluded with a prayer for wisdom and vigilance, the assembly rose slowly. Candles flickered, footsteps echoed on polished floors, and the golden winter sunlight caught in the stained glass, casting fractured patterns across the stone walls. Outside, Chicago carried on its streets, still gleaming, its shops still open, its citizens still unaware of the quiet dominion of the tonic. But within the hearts of those who had listened, a seed of caution had been sown, and in that soft, attentive silence, the Reverend knew that the city had heard, if only for a moment, the faint echo of truth beneath the amber glow. The journals of Chicago's physicians, usually bound in polished leather and stacked neatly upon library shelves, had begun to fill with a new narrative, one of hesitation, doubt, and quiet reconsideration. For months, the tonic Heroin, golden labeled and celebrated, had been heralded as a marvel of modern chemistry, praised in lecture halls, pharmacy counters, and parlor rooms alike. Yet now, in the waning days of a long, frost-bitten winter, the city's learned men began to whisper among themselves that the medicine they had once endorsed so confidently had betrayed its promise. Dr. Langley, in the solitude of his office lined with volumes of materia medica, was among the first to commit observation to record. His pen trembled slightly as it traced precise accounts of dependence, subtle deterioration, and unforeseen complications. Patients, once vibrant, now lingered at doorways, murmuring requests for additional doses with hands that trembled despite warmth. Children slept so deeply that their guardians feared they might not awaken. Mothers, factory workers, clerks, performers, all bore signs of soft surrender beneath the tonic's refined calm. "The remedy," Langley wrote, his ink pooling slightly on the page, "once celebrated for its gentle efficacy, now presents a silent dominion over those who rely upon it. Its elegance conceals its subtle tyranny. Vigilance is no longer optional, it is imperative." Across the city, other physicians echoed his findings in hushed correspondence. Dr. Harcourt, who had long prided himself on the precision of his prescriptions, now observed a soft tremor of dependence, even among his most disciplined patients. Nurses and matrons in the wards reported irregular breathing, pallor, and tremulous gestures in patients who had received doses deemed entirely appropriate. Each observation, once easily dismissed, now coalesced into a troubling pattern. Editorials in medical journals began to shift in tone. Articles that had once praised the tonic's refinement and efficacy now suggested caution. The language was careful, restrained, yet unmistakable. The city's miracle remedy carried risks, subtle yet pervasive, that could not be ignored. Pharmacies were advised to scrutinize the distribution of the tonic, to counsel patients meticulously, and to observe diligently for signs of dependency. The golden-labeled bottles gleamed as before, yet their beauty was now tinged with a faint, undeniable menace. The reversal was not dramatic. There were no headlines screaming of catastrophe. Chicago's elite continued to admire the tonic. The parlor mothers still administered it with delicate care, and children slept through the long nights with softened sighs. Yet beneath the surface, the current had changed. Physicians now measured not only dosage but character, subtle shifts in behavior, and the soft tremors of reliance. Reports moved cautiously through channels of learned men, shared in letters, discreet meetings, and confidential annotations in ledgers. In lecture halls, instructors spoke of the tonic with careful inflection, emphasizing caution where once they had celebrated ease. Students learned to recognize dependency not in dramatic collapse, but in the subtle softening of the hands, the lengthening of pauses between words, the faintly vacant gaze of those who seemed otherwise content. The golden elixir, once a symbol of progress and refinement, had become a quiet cautionary tale, a reminder that the most elegant solutions may harbor unseen consequences. By evening, Dr. Langley closed his ledger and sat in reflective silence. Through the frost-laden window, the city glimmered in amber lamplight, unaware of the shifting understanding among its healers. Outside, shop windows gleamed with bottles, nurseries glowed softly, and alleys still whispered with cautious exchange. The tonic's hold remained pervasive, refined, and patient. Yet within the hearts of those sworn to observe, prescribe, and guide, a quiet vigilance had taken root. Chicago's miracle, elegant and golden, had been measured against the reality of its effects. And in that measurement, the city's healers learned the limits of progress and the subtle power of dependence that lies hidden in even the most polished of remedies. By early spring, the city's streets began to shift in tone. windows that had once gleamed with polished glass, and the golden-labeled bottles of the tonic now sat dark, shuttered, and silent. Pharmacies that had humbly displayed their amber treasures behind velvet curtains had closed their doors earlier than usual, some indefinitely. The streets, always bustling with the soft clatter of carriage wheels, voices, and hurried footsteps, felt thinner, quieter, as if the city itself were drawing a breath and pausing, uncertain of the next exhalation. Inside Wexler and Sons, the shelves that once held rows of tonic bottles now reflected only the faint, pale light of gas lamps. Edwin moved among them with a careful hand, noting the absence of patrons who had lingered in the alleyways, waited outside, whispered for a bottle just beyond closing time. The air was thick with a scent that lingered after months of transactions, sweet, almond, faint and lingering, the residue of commerce and quiet dependency alike. Even Mr. Wexler, with decades of meticulous experience in the management of tonics and remedies, felt a strange hollowness in the once busy shop. It was not closure by decree or by law, though the city's authorities had indeed begun to enforce tighter oversight. The closures were subtle, incremental, dictated by the invisible hand of caution and the growing awareness of consequence. Many pharmacists, faced with reports of dependency, erratic dosing, and the increasing scrutiny of physicians and city officials, had chosen the path of discretion. They shuttered windows, locked doors, and observed from within, ensuring that neither the public's curiosity nor their own conscience would be tempted by further exposure. Customers noticed first in the absence of warmth and light. Mothers who had quietly relied upon the tonic found their avenues closed. Clerks, who had come to expect the comfort of measured doses at the end of a long day, were met with vacant storefronts. Performers seeking calm before the night's recital found the familiar gleam of amber syrup absent from display. The city, unaccustomed to the sudden stillness, felt a subtle, pervasive unease. The golden bottles, once symbols of progress and refinement, had disappeared behind locked shutters, leaving only the faintest shimmer in memory and reflection. Dr. Harcourt walked along the quiet streets one afternoon, observing the change. The absence of commerce, the hushed alleys, the darkened windows, they spoke of a shift not merely in business but in societal consciousness. The tonic's reign, so elegant and invisible, had drawn notice. Its consequences had been measured, discussed, debated, and finally acknowledged, and in response, the city's purveyors of medicine had taken pause. Even in the shuttered pharmacies, the amber bottles gleamed faintly in the dim light of storage rooms. Their beauty remained undiminished, yet their purpose had become fraught. No longer were they freely dispensed. Their influence, once subtle and pervasive, had been constrained, yet not fully controlled. The quiet dependency persisted in households, factories, and wards, echoing the unspoken legacy of the tonic, even in absence. Citizens moved cautiously, murmuring softly to one another about the closure of familiar establishments, the disappearance of what had been so readily available. Mothers adjusted to the missing remedy with guarded hope. Fathers glanced more attentively at the health of their children. Clerks and labourers managed with the faint anxiety of withdrawal, not dramatic, but insistent, subtle and unyielding. The golden-labelled bottles, though shuttered from view, continued to exert their quiet dominion in memory, expectation, and lingering desire. By nightfall, West Madison Street and the surrounding avenues were hushed, gas lamps reflecting upon frost and cobblestone. The shuttered pharmacies, dark and silent, bore witness to the city's reluctant acknowledgement. Even miracles, golden and elegant as they may appear, can cast shadows longer than anticipated, and quiet dominions often linger, patient and unyielding, long after the windows are closed. With the city's pharmacies shuttered and the golden-labelled tonic no longer flowing freely into hands eager for comfort, a new reality began to settle over Chicago. The streets, alleys, and homes that had once hummed with discreet exchanges and whispered gratitude now carried a heavier, quieter tension. Those who had become reliant on the amber elixir, the clerks, mothers, factory workers, and performers, were left to reckon with its absence. A subtle panic threaded itself through the city, unseen by the majority, yet impossible to ignore by those who had been touched by the tonic's soft dominion. In tenements along Halstead and Monroe, young clerks paced their rooms, coat sleeves rolled, hands pressed against trembling fingers, eyes darting toward empty cupboards and locked cabinets. The tonic had been their nightly companion, a soft veil that dulled the edges of fatigue, anxiety, and life's relentless demands. Without it, they felt exposed, raw, the quiet anxiety swelling in the hollows of their chests. One young man, a timid accountant named Fletcher, sat on the edge of his cot, forehead pressed against the frost-cold window, whispering fragments of a plea to the absent remedy. Just one more to steady. But the bottles were gone, the glass locked away, the amber liquid beyond reach. In the homes of the affluent, the effect was equally stark. Mothers who had administered careful doses to their children now observed restless wakefulness with growing alarm. A child stirred repeatedly, tiny fists clenched, eyes wide with unease, while the mother's own hands trembled from anxiety and interrupted sleep. The tonic, which had promised ease and calm, had left behind an emptiness palpable and persistent. No longer was comfort freely available. The absence itself carried weight, pressing against the household like the cold pressed along the frosted windows. Even the performers at music halls, once buoyed by the measured solace of the tonic before recitals, found themselves faltering. The violinist whose bow had once drawn music with liquid grace trembled, losing rhythm. The soprano, whose voice had floated through velvet halls with hypnotic serenity, now struggled to sustain even a simple phrase, her lungs tight with anxiety and longing. The amber elixir, though hidden from view, lingered in memory, leaving an ache that neither breath nor effort could soothe. In alleyways behind closed pharmacies, the once discreet gatherings now carried an edge of desperation. Men and women huddled beneath flickering lamps, eyes shifting toward shadows that offered no succor. Whispers carried the faint echo of dependence. I need it. I cannot sleep. I cannot calm myself without it. The golden-labeled tonic, once a promise of relief, now existed in absence, a phantom both comforting and cruel. Dr. Langley, observing these patterns through patient reports and personal investigation, recorded the consequences with clinical precision. The tonic's withdrawal was subtle yet pervasive. Hands trembled, pupils dilated, sleep was interrupted, nerves frayed, moods softened into irritability or dulled into apathy. The city's quiet dominion had shifted no longer an indulgence. It had become a presence in its absence, a spectral influence that lingered in homes, wards, and workplaces alike. By nightfall, West Madison Street and its surrounding avenues had grown colder, quieter. The gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows upon frost-covered cobblestones, reflecting the emptiness left behind by the shuttered pharmacies. Behind locked doors, those once soothed by the tonic wrestled with tremors and longing, their bodies and minds straining against absence. The city moved on, bustling and oblivious, while the addicts, silent, hidden, and patient in their need, faced the lingering dominion of a remedy that had both comforted and ensnared. The golden bottles were gone, but their echo remained, and the addicts, left behind, bore the weight of both memory and desire, quiet witnesses to a power that had shaped Chicago far more subtly than any law, ledger, or window display could reveal. By the time spring pressed its first pale light against Chicago's frost-dusted streets, the city had begun to stir uneasily, as though awakening from a long, drugged slumber. Word spread not loudly, not in proclamations or headlines, but in murmurs among physicians, pharmacists, nurses, and families that the golden-labeled tonic, once celebrated for its elegance and efficacy, carried consequences too subtle to be ignored. Heroin, praised in parlors and pharmacy windows alike, was no longer merely a comfort. It had become a source of quiet dread, its absence as potent as its presence. In households along Prairie Avenue and the northern tenements, mothers who had once administered the tonic with confidence now approached the medicine with hesitancy. The first spoonful was given slowly, measured with meticulous care. Eyes flicked to children's faces, observing the smallest twitch of a finger, the faintest flutter of eyelids. Sleep no longer came without vigilance. Calm was no longer taken for granted. The very remedy that had been praised for softening nerves now imposed anxiety upon those entrusted with its use. Factories and workshops bore a similar impression. Clerks, laborers, and artisans who had relied on the tonic to steady trembling hands or ease fatigue now approached their work with caution. The memory of dependence, fresh and unsettling. Supervisors noted with unease the faint tremors, the hesitations, the subtle lapses that had previously gone unnoticed. Even the most disciplined workers found themselves counting the hours between doses, aware that absence could bring unrest, yet presence demanded restraint. At the hospitals, the wards were quieter, more subdued. Nurses moved with precise care, watching mothers and children alike. Patients previously soothed by the tonic's gentle hand now displayed faint traces of anxiety in its absence. The staff observed the shift, recording patterns with clinical attention. Pallor returning to children's cheeks, murmurs of restlessness, subtle tremors in adults. The once celebrated remedy had introduced a new form of vigilance, fear, intertwined with routine, an undercurrent that carried weight in every observation. Even the city's learned men began to acknowledge the truth. At the College of Physicians, debates once confined to the proper dosing of remedies now expanded to the societal consequences of subtle dependence. Professors and students exchanged quiet but earnest counsel. How to warn without alarming, how to regulate without panic, how to balance benefit and harm in a remedy that had slipped from promise to peril. Journals published cautious editorials, no longer extolling the tonic as a marvel but advocating prudence, measurement, and awareness. The public, for its part, began to sense the shift, though only faintly. Patrons noticed shuttered pharmacies, diminished displays, the absence of familiar vials on counters. Mothers whispered to one another in parlors, sharing accounts of restless nights and subtle dependence. Clerks and artisans murmured to friends about irregular supply and the tempering of previously unquestioned relief. The golden-labeled bottles, once icons of refinement and comfort, now inspired caution, a quiet, pervasive fear woven into the fabric of daily life. By night, Chicago's streets felt changed. Gas lamps flickered against cobblestones slick with thawing snow, shadows stretching longer than before. The city moved forward, carrying commerce, conversation, and the hum of industry. Yet beneath it all lay a new consciousness, that remedies, no matter how elegant or golden-labeled, bore weight and consequence. The tonic had taught the city a lesson in vigilance, subtle and insistent, and Chicago, slowly, had begun to learn to fear its cures. The golden bottles still gleamed, carefully displayed behind shuttered windows or tucked away in private homes. Their beauty remained undeniable, but so too did the caution they now inspired. Relief, once effortless and celebrated, now required vigilance. Calm, once freely given, now demanded attention. And in this quiet reckoning, the city understood that even the most refined remedy could cast a long, subtle shadow over life itself. The winter had finally begun to loosen its grip on Chicago, leaving the city streets wet with thawing snow and shimmering in the hesitant sunlight of early spring. Yet the golden-labeled bottles, once the pride of pharmacies and parlors alike, cast shadows that stretched far beyond their polished glass. They were everywhere and nowhere, gleaming with promise but burdened with consequence, a phantom presence that lingered in homes, hospitals, factories, and theatres long after the tonic had been measured, administered, and consumed. Edwin Wexler walked along State Street one morning, lantern in hand, observing the subtle shifts the tonic had wrought. Shuttered pharmacies lined the avenue, their polished windows dark and reflective. Inside, empty shelves bore silent witness to the retreat of commerce, while the occasional bottle, carefully hidden in a locked cupboard, gleamed faintly with amber light. Patrons passed without pause, faces pale, hands tucked beneath coats, eyes darting toward darkened doorways, where once the glow had beckoned so irresistibly. The phantom of the golden label, unseen yet unmistakable, had begun to govern their movements and anxieties. In parlours across the city, mothers whispered in hushed tones about children who slept too deeply or who stirred with a tremor of need when denied even a measured dose. Clerks and factory workers, accustomed to the tonic's soft calm, now navigated days with subtle tension, aware of the quiet absence that weighed upon them. In music halls, performers faltered, their hands shaking as if recalling a lost equilibrium, their voices trembling with the memory of reliance upon the amber elixir. The city's pulse, once measured in the confident rhythms of commerce and domestic life, now carried an undercurrent of apprehension, a quiet echo of dependency and desire. Dr. Langley observed the phenomenon with clinical precision, recording not only the physiological effects but the societal reverberations. Dependency had spread in silence, subtle and pervasive. Families whispered to one another about dosage and observation, neighbors remarked on pallor and fatigue, and nurses documented trembling hands and pinprick pupils with meticulous care. The tonic had woven itself into the routines of the city, and now its absence or even its memory governed behavior with a delicate yet unyielding influence. Even the lawmen, Constable Whitlock and Sergeant Dunham, noted the city's new rhythm. Alleys that once carried the quiet shuffle of clandestine exchanges were now lined with anticipation and restraint. Patrons of the shuttered pharmacies waited, pacing softly, murmuring to one another, eyes flicking toward doorways, long dark. The golden-labeled bottles had become a phantom not only of relief but of authority, shaping conduct as powerfully as law or custom. Reverend Pembroke, in his pulpit, addressed the congregation with a solemnity born of observation and reflection. His sermon spoke of vigilance and responsibility, of the subtle dominion of remedies that promised comfort but exacted quiet tolls. Parishioners left the pews thoughtful, aware that the amber glow in their memories was both boon and burden, a beautiful enchantment that had reshaped the contours of domestic and civic life alike. And so Chicago moved forward, bustling, industrious, alive. The city's citizens carried on with commerce, conversation, and labor. Yet beneath the surface, in homes, hospitals, nurseries, and theaters, the phantom lingered. It was the memory of ease, the shadow of reliance, the quiet insistence of amber light upon frost-laden streets. The golden-labeled tonic had arrived as a miracle, had spread like a gentle hand over nerves and sleeplessness, and had departed, leaving behind an indelible mark upon the city's rhythms and its consciousness. The amber glow, even absent from counters and cupboards, remained a sentinel, patient, unyielding, eternal. Chicago, enamored with refinement, had glimpsed the peril that accompanied its comforts, yet the phantom of the golden label whispered still, teaching that even miracles carry shadows and that elegance, when bound to necessity, can endure long after its promise is forgotten. And in that quiet, lingering presence, the city understood the subtle truth. The tonic had never truly left.